Welcome. Can you hear me?
Hey, I'm gonna turn the volume up. Where are you streaming this?
We're live on YouTube right now.
Hi, guys.
Welcome.
We're live.
Thank you for joining us, Father Dcn Ananias. Tonight, that's a cross between today and tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about the notion of the classical virtues, pagan philosophy, pagan literature, natural law, and epistemology. It's a bunch of topics at once, but I wanted to talk about this because of, first of all, because of the interactions that I had with the pagans 2 and 3 weeks ago. So if you recall, I was challenging a lot of pagans on Twitter, and we had a lot of pagans come, and it was kind of a dramatic series of interactions for several days back and forth. I did a couple live streams critiquing paganism. And some of the first problems that popped up that I want to encounter or discuss with Father Dcn is the issue of why we need to address modern questions of justification in terms of epistemology, because we had a lot of pagans that were under the attitude, which we see even at times amongst Roman Catholics, that it suffices for justification merely to appeal to authorities. In other words, we can just cite Aristotle, the philosopher, as Aquinas does in the Summa quite often. We can just cite Aquinas, and it kind of, that sort of ends the debate, right? Because an authority figure who is respected, who is intelligent, etc., who is revered by the church, by the ancient medieval world, really ends the debate. And I mean, that's kind of ultimately the logic of the Roman Catholic papal position. Somehow the papacy gives us epistemic certitude, something like that, which I don't think it actually does that. So one question is going to be about the correct and incorrect usage of authorities, and the fact that authorities do bolster our case, but there's no way that an authority can be the justification or the proof necessarily, especially human authorities. And I'm saying this because for those that weren't aware, I had a friend reaching out to the biggest pagan out there in terms of channel, or one of the biggest, Survive the Jive, and I had issued a challenge for him to debate because he's the most well-read and philosophically minded of the public neo-pagan. I don't know what his specific position is, but I know he's a fan of Aristotle and Plato. And my understanding is that Survive the Jive's response was that he isn't interested in any position that would challenge ancient eminent men. So who are you to disagree with Plato or Aristotle? Which, ironically, is very bizarre because, of course, Aristotle fundamentally disagreed with Plato. So Aristotle didn't seem to think that having an eminent authority in terms of his teacher necessarily made the position true. And clearly that's an incorrect usage of that. Then I want to move to other questions that aren't the same as that issue, but relate to other problems in natural law. We have to be careful, obviously, being on YouTube, with what terms we use for the purpose of bodily organs in terms of sexual ethics and telos. Why it is we can't just immediately look to the Hellenic ideas of telos or Aristotelian natural law theory to come to a full, perfect, clear conclusion as to what our sexual ethic is. And then other attendant questions like, why would we not want to see, for example, online just appeals to ancient canons, right? What's wrong with just appealing to an ancient canon, for example, to say, well, going to the theaters is wrong? So I've got a series of questions, and I've got some sources that I've kind of pulled out here to refer to. One book that I'll mention before I ask Father Dcn some of these questions is the really excellent text by Jaroslav Pelikan that you often hear me reference, Christianity and Classical Culture. And there's many reasons why this is a really good book, but for one, it's a great introduction to how the Cappadocians utilize and purge at the same time Hellenic philosophy. What about literature, right? It's not just a question of Aristotle or Plato's metaphysics. What about lit, right? What about the classics of the Roman state and Roman literature, Cicero? We know St. Augustine. We know that especially St. Jerome. St. Jerome almost had a verging on idolatrous attitude towards some of the Latin writers like Cicero. In the first 500 or so pages of City of God, we get Augustine doing an apologetic analysis of the pros and the cons. And yes, his attitude is largely in the negative when it comes to the pagan virtues. But not everybody in the Orthodox Catholic tradition had that negative attitude towards the virtues. And that we will get into in terms of some of the flaws in the Augustinian theology and metaphysic. And that, unfortunately, will also affect Augustine's ethic, especially when it comes to marital relations. So when we look at how we view things outside the faith, outside the church, we have to be careful to basically sail between Scylla and Charybdis, because there's the extreme on the one hand of something like Origenism or Hegelianism, where we fall so in love with non-Christian systems and system building that we try to basically say Christianity is a cloak for Neoplatonism in the case of Origen, or idealism in the case of Hegel. And those are extremes that we want to avoid on the pagan side of things. And then there's the opposite extreme that we want to avoid on the opposite direction of the fideistic, evangelical, fundamentalist approach where, philosophy is bad. Secular music is bad. Secular entertainment and art is bad, you see. And so there's these either or dialectics that oftentimes pop up. And what I want to do is get into not just the patristic appropriation of the pagan virtues and their attitude towards it, but also more specificity in terms of the questions that we're raising about the good, and more nuanced issues relating to how the church fathers weren't always as rigorous as we might think they are, but that also doesn't make them these wild liberals at the same time. So my first question to you, Father Deacon, I mean, you feel free to talk about anything that you would like to, but I remember Seraphim Hamilton had a really good way to sort of parse this out when he was talking about how we should view pagan philosophy. And he said, if you think about it, it's not really an issue of pagan or non-pagan, because pagan, you could construe pagan to be anything that's outside of the church, and it's not necessarily pagan. And the church has plenty of customs and things that she's baptized that were harmless pagan traditions. So Hamilton's nuance was, why don't we think of it just in terms of idolatrous and not idolatrous? And in that way, we're really not hampered by, or we're not caught in a false dialectic of thinking that there aren't real truths, real virtues outside of the church.
That's an excellent way to put it. Because there are goods outside of the church. And like you said too, and maybe later on, after we get through just the kind of analysis of justification that these issues come up when you were discussing and debating with the various pagans. Citation of authority, what that means. After we treat that, maybe we should actually talk about some of the Augustinian views and things that have plagued the West of kind of these dialectics and understanding teleology and natural law and various goods versus a singular good. What do you say?
Let's start with justification then. So let's start with...
I don't need to provide a justification for my justification. Let's just start with...
Well, let's start with let's say the Roman Catholic attitude before we get to the pagan. Let's take the Roman Catholic approach, which is basically a foundationalist approach to these questions. And what would you say to a Roman Catholic who, and I think you described your experience at a Catholic college in terms of being in the circles of a lot of Thomists and Aristotelians. What's the problem? And I know this may sound basic to you, but for the sake of the audience, what's the problem with just thinking like the ancients and the medievals did? That, I mean, why can't just citing an eminent authority basically be a kind of justification? What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, we're really looking for, I mean, what does authority mean? I guess is the first kind of question. What do you take that to mean? And it's almost as if, you know, you and I have talked about this too, that what distinguishes us from Protestants is that the church was endowed with the power, the apostolic power of normative power, like a legal power. So in that sense, as an authority, are you, maybe it would be good to ask, are you saying that's what Aristotle has? Does he have a divinely sanctioned authority that's the power of law and whatever he says? Or is he's proven wise on that? We should listen to him. You know, we have to kind of flesh out what these things mean. And part of it's asking too, what are good reasons? That's what justification is. What are good reasons for holding a belief that we believe to be true? And if you,
well, what's wrong with saying that I cite a eminent authority? Why is that not a good reason?
well, because which authority? Is it going to be Plato, Aristotle? It becomes arbitrary. What if I cite a modern authority that's refuted Aristotle? Who decides who the authority is? It pushes the question back. It doesn't solve the problem. Of course, we have some notion of authority, like when we're building cases or something like that. But it's the question of, how is this person an authority? Are they? Can I pick another authority that contradicts that authority? Simply citing somebody is, well, this is my authority.
Well, I
That's
mean,
who I use.
okay, but Aristotle, Plato, and Aquinas are universally received eminent ancient authorities. So what's wrong with that?
Don't we deal with the same issue with in scientism today? 99% of scientists now agree. And that makes does that make it true? Does it make it necessarily follow? I mean, is it arbitrary? How do we decide who the authority? I guess it pushes that question back. What do you mean universally accepted? By whom? And is that how we establish authorities? That you know what? We're all going to decide today that we're going to take a vote and universally accept that chimpanzees are authorities on quantum physics. It just doesn't solve the problem,
right?
For me to be
right, because we don't know what
how
exactly.
Do we establish what's an authority?
Yeah, because you start asking the question, and it becomes, well, because they're universally received. Well, I mean, people in ancient China didn't accept Aquinas, so I mean, why medieval China didn't accept Aquinas? So it's not universally received. Oh, well, just in the West, just in the Catholic Church. Okay, so just in the Catholic Church. So it's basically whatever the Pope says. I mean, that's the final analysis in terms of Roman Catholic epistemology that is supposed to give us the certitude. But the problem again is just it keeps moving the problem back a step, and that's why, again, as we always point out, the ancient and medieval world didn't ask the questions typically that Descartes and Hume and Kant asked, and so you don't have to answer Descartes, Hume, and people like that's questions about skepticism and certitude. But if you choose to not answer those things, then really what happens is that the atheist, the worldview of the naturalist will just keep repeating these arguments as they have for the last 500 years. And it's not going to convince anyone on an intellectual level through solid argumentation that there's actually a response to those things. So I wanted to hit on first the problem as it pertains to the Roman Catholic attitude to epistemology. and what the problem is with just citing an authority. For example, I had a Roman Catholic guy that came in Discord or Twitter space a week or two ago, and he was a trad Catholic, and he was saying, well, I want to take on your issue with authority. He said, because I think that it actually does resolve the problem of epistemology to just say that the Pope decides. And then I kept just reiterating this point that it doesn't actually solve the problem of epistemic justification, right? Because I know you believe the Roman Catholic system, but you're saying that the Roman Catholic system is true because of these law principles within natural law, natural philosophy, natural theology first. But my question is more fundamental. And I'm like, how do you know that those things are the case? And he says, well, because the papacy has said these things are true. So in other words, even natural law now gets ultimately in this argument justified or based.
It's the same
based on the papacy
tactics as foundationalism, right?
Well, it is a
foundationalism
view.
Says that it has to ground out in some basicality, whereby we mean basicality that there are no further reasons or arguments, but that ends up being the kind of justification in itself of all other non-basic beliefs, correct? And as you know, in the epistemology that I do, that I show, there's several critiques of that, both of circularity, the argument from arbitrariness, because it asks the question, well, wait a minute, how is that the criteria, the justification? But the way that they've couched it in terms of foundationalism is that, well, you can't ask that question because that's the foundation, that's the basicality. Well, they do the same thing with the papacy and authority, right? The way that I've set it up is it eventually has to go back to the authority. I arbitrarily pick this authority, let's call him the Pope or the papacy. And so you can't ask any questions about the justification for that because that is the justification.
Exactly.
Right? So it begs the question, it ends up being arbitrary. Why not we say that, well, I've got my jar of pistachios here, and that's my authority and that's where it all grounds out. All things come to. And if somebody says, well, that's ridiculous, you explain yourself. Well, no, because it's properly basic.
Yeah, if they can be arbitrary about what constitutes proper basicality, so can we, right?
Absolutely.
And there's no reason to choose one over the other, right? Without a prior criteria. But if there's a prior criteria, then the original argument wasn't properly basic. So that's a great point then about illustrating that. And I want to stress this too, whether it's talking to a pagan guy like a Platonist, or whether we're talking to a Roman Catholic about the principles of causality, the metaphysical structure of the external world, and the distinctions between the one and the many, right? We probably agree with a lot of those people on those points. So we're not disagreeing with there being telos or causation. What we're disagreeing with is that the route that you got there to get to that conclusion, that you have a good reason to say that. Not that there's no such thing as causation or teleology. So these are just never-ending problems that people have when you make these arguments. Oh, you don't believe in teleology? Or you're a Humean? No, I'm saying that Hume's criticism applies to you on your system. That doesn't make me a Humean.
Some people are saying, turn my volume up. Is that possible?
I've got you up all the way on my end. So if you could if you want to pull your mic closer or something like that, maybe. But you're all the way up on my end.
Let me try turning it up. Tell me if that messes things up. Hello. I get to speak really loud.
No,
how about that?
It was fine to me. Just ignore these people. A lot of people are just trolling and causing problems on purpose. But
yeah,
I listened. You sounded perfect to me, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, we brought this up in ethics too because we're asking about, ethical theories and why would this theory be correct? Like, is it true and stuff like that?
Could you swallow the microphone with that? I'm just joking. Like, people are always like, "Can you do this? Can you do this? Could you put the microphone in your mouth? That maybe you would be louder." Yeah. I'm just joking. You sound fine. Everybody says you're fine.
Well, with the new Musk, I'll just be hooked up my Neuralink.
Oh yeah, so it'll work.
I won't even need microphones. Like my thoughts, I won't even have to actually move my mouth or speak. Like my thoughts will just be like, furthermore, right? Well, what makes something a good reason for what makes something a justification?
Right.
And is it because we all agree that this is going to be the case, that we're all going to decide that this is the theory? And most people stop there. And I think it's not until later in philosophy that we kind of, ask further questions that back further than that, well, what makes somebody justified in actually holding that position? It can't be simply because we all decide it's an authority, or we all have decided that now you reduce something that's supposed to be objective to simply a subjective, relativistic. But it seems that people really didn't kind of question those things before, that it's like, well, if we all believe this, I mean, it's absurd to think otherwise.
Yeah, but keep in mind
so
too
you just
that
kind of move forward with the project and you never get to the question of like, well, what's a justification?
yeah, and then people say, well, you shouldn't even ask these questions because these are questions that atheists and Protestant reformers and Calvinists they ask these kinds of questions. Well, that'd be like saying, okay, so then we shouldn't do calculus. The ancient world didn't do calculus.
That's a great argument.
We shouldn't use it. It wasn't used by any eminent authorities. And who are you to use the mathematics of people from the Enlightenment, like Leibniz and Newton, right? It's just a silly point.
Yeah, it's let's call it the fallacy of antiquarianism.
Well, there is a fallacy of appeal to antiquity, like as if because it's old, it's somehow better, it's more true, right? And these are fallacies. So is the appeal to authority a fallacy. But keep in mind, it's depending when the appeal is made, right? So this is what I wanted to get to next. Is it could you tell us when is appeal to authority a valid situation, and when is it a fallacy?
Whenever I say it is.
Yes. Thank you for being our final authority and resolving all epistemic questions by just appealing to yourself.
You like how I did that? So again, we use authority. I always think are really good because it's both practical and there's philosophy and epistemic issues behind the way that we actually practice law. So we can go to law and kind of illustrate these things that, well, look, we use authority, but we can't just go into a case and say, well, hey, this is the authority and they say this, and so the case is over. It becomes a part of building a case. The authority can be questioned. You can bring in counter authorities too, people who might have spent enough time or receive a level of education and performance within society within that area that it's deemed that we accept, that go, okay, there's some sort of authority that they should possibly be listened. What does it mean when we do that? They should possibly, given their work and expertise and their performance, be listened to first before somebody that didn't put that work in. That's a good way to think about it. And so where it becomes a fallacy is if we say we make a necessary connection, because that's how all the fallacies, as far as non sequiturs, it doesn't follow. You're stating some sort of premise or support that says, well, therefore necessarily this. If there is, this is why we call them fallacies of relevance, right? Because they're not actually, the premise or what you're putting is not actually logically relevant. It might be psychologically relevant. It might be relevant in some other way. But when you present something as if it's an argument, you're presenting it as if it's logically relevant. The premise, or what I'm purporting to be the premise to support the conclusion, is logically relevant. And if it's not, you've committed a fallacy. So as far as the fallacy of relevance of fallacy of authority would be, if you used an authority that either was unqualified Or if you cite an authority that might be qualified and say, therefore it necessarily follows because this person said something that the conclusion must be true. Do you see that? That doesn't necessarily follow. Even if the person is qualified, so it's not the fallacy of unqualified authority. Let's say that they're actually qualified to speak in this matter. And you cite them and then say, therefore, this must be the case. Well, that doesn't follow, right? You'd have to say that you'd have to make some type of modal argument that authorities in their field always, let me rephrase it, let me rewind. What a valid deductive argument is, if the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. So if you present an argument that my premise is true that the person's an authority on this particular matter, therefore it's false that he could say anything false. That seems ridiculous, doesn't it? So you're telling me they can never get anything wrong, even in their area. That doesn't logically follow. There's no necessity that would entail that they're incorrigible. They always have to speak the truth on this because they're an authority. But isn't this exactly how people present these? Well, it's Aristotle. He obviously, he's infallible. It's incorrigible. You can't doubt. It's indubitable. Then that means that his authority, and I'd even grant that Aristotle's an authority. But does his authority mean that he always, in every place, in every logical possible world, has to speak truths? I mean, think about how silly that is.
Yeah. What about so looking at my notes. So the place of citing authorities, again, depends on what type of question is being asked and in what sense, what kind of authorities we're appealing to, right? So if we're appealing to human authorities, then there's going to be limitations. If we're appealing to divine authorities, who can be at times humans as well, then it kind of steps up a notch to another level, another order, maybe.
Yes.
And then ultimately God, is going to be, in our worldview, self-referencing, because there's no authority that he would appeal to or have to submit to. So it's at that level, it becomes a self-referencing authority in our worldview. Now, I understand that people aren't necessarily going to accept that, but what our goal is to do is to present our position and how it works, and then compare that to the other positions that will attempt to do what you often point out is an autonomous epistemology, where it's a project by which some properly basic or foundationalist conception or belief or self-evident notion becomes a way for autonomous man to try to erect a system, a worldview, a thing that's a project, right, for him. And most of Western philosophy is a system building project. And the reason that they fail is not because we are just saying, oh, they fail. No, they actually do fail. And they fail because of the autonomous starting point. The ultimate example of this is, well, you could argue all the Greeks have this autonomous project as well. For them, reason is preeminent, right? For the Greeks, man is man because of reason, and reason is worshipped. It's so close to the divine that the reasoning faculty is itself a spark of the divine, you could even say. And in the same way, modern philosophy and the Enlightenment re-exalts reasoning to this semi-divine status.
Yeah.
And that puts man in this position of trying to then make his mind do what for the Christian the divine mind does. Since there's no divine mind in the modern philosophical sense, the human mind becomes the replacement and the arbiter of reality. It is the new divine mind. But because it's a finite, limited thing, it can't actually achieve this project. So it's doomed to fail because it can't do what it's trying to do. And so
that's a good way to put it.
One thing we can agree with St. Augustine on is that pride is the root of all sin. And since pride is the root of all sin, then man's projects are usually, in terms of philosophy, secular philosophy, right? The project of secular philosophy, whether it's Plato, Aristotle, and I'm going to say, I know Plato's a religious philosopher in many ways, or even Aristotle, but it's still secular philosophy or pagan philosophy to us. The reason they fail is because they start with man's mind as the linchpin and the interpreter of all reality. So they don't start with divine revelation, the triune God. That's obviously not their starting point. But that also doesn't mean that, oh, well, then if they got these serious things wrong, then everything they said is wrong. Everything they said is bad. It's tainted. It's demonic, and you got to throw it down. Now, in a sense, it is demonic, right? Because it is tainted. But what's the proper, let's get into the proper attitude towards the pagan philosophers, Greek philosophy, Roman classical writers, classical pedagogy. Why would we not, Father Deacon, if you're what you're saying is true about autonomous systems and system building projects or whatever for these philosophers? Well, wouldn't we just toss philosophy out and be a fundamentalist, or be somebody who thinks that philosophy is somehow inherently evil?
Well, I'm actually going to use Augustine in this, and Augustine says here and in many works that, citing Genesis, that God created and it was good. And Augustine talks about, he has a really good section on here about how to think about sin is privation. Let's see, what section is that, just in case people, I'm not going to read. We're going to sit there and read through the entirety of the City of God for you.
Well, this is good because a lot of people fall into the tendency, and Augustine had this view himself when he was a Manichaean, of thinking that sin is a metaphysical thing. It's the things themselves, or that sin or evil has some kind of ontological, substantial existence.
Yeah, and he talks about, both in book 12, the deficient cause of evil, also good and bad angels and stuff like that. But he references that, sin doesn't have any positive ontological status, is not a substance. And insofar as something exists, it's good. So sin really becomes misuse, misdirectedness, right, towards non-being, right? Because that's not the way this thing is supposed to be, right? Then you're moving out of the being of it. So I think that's an important point for bringing that up, is that only in a kind of Manichaeanism would you fall into, I won't say that's the only way, but adopting a kind of Manichaean mindset that things have that evil and bad have kind of a positive existence or something like that.
Right, exactly.
That you would say, well, I need to get, exclude all of this. Once you have this kind of correct understanding of that all things that exist are good, you can go through the pagan poets and philosophers and be able to see and identify misuse versus good. And we've talked about, I bring this up all the time, that I think we brought this up with, it's mentioned in Staniloy too, that because the standard of truth is orthodoxy, and it transcends all systems and philosophies, orthodoxy never had to marry itself to any particular philosophy, but stood above and gave you the ability to say, here's where they got it right, here's where they got it wrong. And that's because things do exist, and because human beings exist, and not only do they exist in the image of God. It's impossible for human beings to speak falsely on everything 100% of the time. So once you take those two things, the denial of this kind of Manichaeanist view, a correct view of goodness and being versus sin as being privation, and the view that the standard is orthodoxy, to look upon those things, you can now actually read these different pagan authors and be able to say, they got it right here, they got it wrong here, which is exactly what I do with the philosophy. My students always ask me, who's your favorite philosopher? And I'm like, they're all wrong, every single one of them. And everybody in the department is wrong, and that department. But do I say they're wrong about everything 100% of the time? I would say no. There's things Aristotle's right about that are good. There's things he's wrong about. There's things that Plato are right about. And we can say that from an Orthodox privileged epistemic position. That's what I'm trying to say. So you don't need to fall into this dialectics of only orthodoxy and you don't read anything else. And think about also the practicality of that too. You are to be the salt of the earth. If you do not read pagan secular literature, if you don't understand what's going on, first of all, if you don't read the history of ideas, you're not going to understand what's going on and why we are in the place that we are and how you can actually help people. So I'm not saying everybody is obligated to do this, but there is a certain Christian obligation that we know and be sufficiently equipped in all the different areas, the sciences and literature, and I'm speaking secularly, and the secular in philosophy, because how are you going to answer and give a defense? How are you going to offer if you're like, I don't know what is that you're saying. Never heard that before. So I'd actually say there is a duty for many Orthodox Christians to be actually involved in doing, in even current literature and movies and stuff like that, so that you can be the salt of the earth.
Yeah, there's so many fascinating places in City of God that deal with these subjects. And I did mark some of these off before we got on here because I wanted to, I for a long time intended on going back to and doing lectures on this. It was one of the first books I read back when I was beginning to question Protestantism. I read the whole thing and was really struck with the fact that there might be elements where he's amenable to the idea of unconditional election or a fixed number of the elect, but really nothing else in this book is at all a vindication of Calvinism. But there are elements and places where Augustinian theology has big deficiencies and problems. And being somebody who became a Roman Catholic in 2003 through reading so much of Augustine, I was it was difficult for me to let a lot of that go. So I had such a high view of him that it was a pill to swallow before I would begin to see that there are actual problems in his theology in many places. Not just the absolute divine simplicity and filioque. It's not just statements about contradictions, I guess I should say, about created grace, at the same time affirming deification. There's problems in his Christology as well that lend to either Monophysitism or Nestorian ideas. I'm not saying he's a Monophysite or a Nestorian. I'm saying that there's statements and places.
In his soteriology too.
Yeah. There are places where it can be problematic. That's what I want to get to today, was the dialectical problem in his view of free will. And one problem is that because he was very influenced, as he himself says, after his Manichaean phase, if I recall, that's when he got into Neoplatonism. And so he read Plotinus, and he'd read these Neoplatonic treatises that helped him move towards Christianity. But then we had a new problem where he had imbibed these ideas. For example, the idea that your gaze and your intentionality has to be fixed on the one. In Neoplatonic theology, there's an emphasis on the one over the many. And so if you believe that the will has to be fixed on the one, and that sin basically consists in your fixation being deviated to the many, then that's a lesser good. And in that system, a lesser good kind of ends up being an evil.
An evil.
Yeah, and so this is also a problem for the beatific vision, which in the City of God he does appear to affirm a version of beatific vision. You could potentially read his paragraph as in an Orthodox way too, because he doesn't necessarily say that this is excluded until only the afterlife, which the later Roman Catholic position specifies. I think it's Innocent the Second or the Third that has the beatific vision dogma in Denzinger, but there is this notion in Augustine that he usually does bring up in moral situations where, for example, if the question comes up of whether marriage is a sacrament or whether there's some necessary sin involved in the action of marital union, Augustine still believes that it's nearly impossible to avoid sin, even in a marital state. So the bizarre part of this is that, well, I mean, how can it be a sacrament if you can't avoid sinning in the action? I mean, that's just bizarre, right? And I think you made a good point that a lot of times we bring into Christianity we read everything through the sins that we had a problem with, right? Like if I had a problem with gluttony, then if I convert, if I'm a big old dude, then I'm typically going to say, oh, well, everybody's problem is we're all tempted by our gut, we all overeat, and so I might overemphasize and stress fasting, right? Because for me, that was, it wasn't really, I'm not saying me, but the hypothetical fat me, right, is overeating a problem. You see what I'm saying? Like we'll read it through the vice that we had. So long story short, I think that because Augustine, known for being very profligate and sleeping around, when he was teaching and writing Latin or whatever his instruction job was, that's what he was into, right? He had a concubine, he had a son, a Deodatus, and all this. So I think people know about this probably, but he came under the preaching of St. Ambrose eventually, which, that and the prayers of his mother, as he says in Confessions, was ultimately what converted him. But it took him a long time, right? At the end of later on, he writes retractions, and he retracts quite a few of the positions that weren't correct, weren't orthodox. He clarifies things that he thought were wrong when he was younger. We have to keep that in mind too, right? That just because St. Augustine had XYZ view doesn't mean he was right. And in fact, Ubi's new video, which I did share, and the interview that they did with Dr. Bradshaw was really good in pointing out the nuances and the problems in Augustine's position. And the problem, ultimately, I'll hand it over to you, Father Deacon, is not that he was reading pagan philosophy. It's that he seemed to view his personal problems as something that was remedied by a rigorous position. And we all can fall into that, right? We can have that same attitude. And that's what led him to think, and this is proven by his descendants and people that follow the radical Augustinian positions like the Jansenists. The Jansenists were big promoters of the notion that the heart is either inflamed with love towards God or it's sinning in worshiping and focusing on lesser goods. That's a classic sort of Jansenist framework. That's a false dialectic between the goodness of the natural world. So in other words, the natural world becomes basically a trap and a bait for us to sin. And so how could it be God creating goodness? And by the way, some of the Latin fathers went so far as to even say that it's that pleasure in the sexual action itself is a sin. If you enjoy the pleasure of it, it's actually a sin. All of that is just over the top and overly rigorous, and I don't think it's correct. And it's because of, by the way, not just the Neoplatonic, but a Stoic influence. And Ubi shows, I think, convincingly that a lot of the Latin fathers had adopted Stoic attitudes towards these things because there wasn't a full, it's just a false presupposition, right? So it's not that philosophy itself is the problem. It's not reading philosophy. It's not reading Stoics is the problem. It's not reading Plato that's the problem. It's not sex itself that's the problem. The problem in all of these positions is thinking that the problem is some other existing thing and not my own passions. Does that make sense? In other words, evil is not located primarily in some metaphysical thing. Oh, it's that thing over there. It's that system. It's that structure. It's that philosophy. It's my will being directed away from the good. That's all evil is in a moral sense. There is the privative sense, but the moral sense of evil is literally only me moving my will away from the good. And that doesn't mean that it's bad to will other goods. because there are many goods. That's the point of the essence synergy distinction, is that God is not only monad. God is also three, and he's also many in his energies and
so
works.
You can see the influence of Neoplatonic thought in that. Like, I thought that was an excellent point, that in Neoplatonic thought that affects a lot of what we're talking about, like, for example, Origin, and that you get these dialectics, that anything lesser than the best is wrong.
And must be some kind of
deprivation
sin.
Of
exactly.
being. And that's what we can fall into. And by the way, there's a philosophical term for this, supererogation. Have you ever heard of that?
Well, yeah, it's a term that's used in Roman Catholic theology for works of supererogation. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so ironically, supererogation is acts that are above and beyond the call of duty. And so what that allows for is that, well, lesser goods, because there's a multiple of goods, are good. Even though there might be some acts that are above and beyond that. And it reminds me of how certain systems can't actually accommodate something like the concept of supererogation, or that there could be multiple levels of goods. For example, utilitarianism has this problem too, that you've always got to maximize, right? It's always, the good is always in terms of consequences, right? So you've got to maximize, you make every decision optimistic and maximize the benefits overall. And so the problem with that would be that suppose you are a doctor of medicine, and according to consequentialism, utilitarian ethics, what is right, there's nothing intrinsically right or wrong. It's right in virtue of maximizing the good over the greatest number of people, or the greatest kind of net balance, or something like that. And suppose that ends up being that you're going to fly to Haiti and Africa, and the maximum benefit would be to do that, to sacrifice your life, and you don't see your family at all. You don't see your kids, you don't see your family. All your money goes to this charitable act. Well, that seems wrong, right? That the consequences would say the person who maybe does that occasionally but spends time with the family would actually be wrong. And it reminds me something similar. That's a good. Supererogation would be going above and beyond, or something like that. But don't you feel that there's a similarity, the same way that utilitarianism can't accommodate supererogation, and the notion of multiple goods at different levels, so too would a system like this that would be influenced by Neoplatonism.
Well, and keep in mind too that if you read Free Choice and St. Maximus, there's a really good chapter on the errors in Augustine's dialectical conception of what free will is. So because he thinks that the good is only one, he has to lay out his notion of free will as a choice between good and evil.
Yeah.
And then the problem is that, well, then in the eschaton, how do we have free will if free will is defined as choice? Because there's not multiple things to will in his version of beatific vision. There's only the divine essence, or the divine unity that we can't move our gaze from, right? And by the way, Origen, if you think about it, was a little more consistent in this regard. I mean, Origen is a total heretic, but I'm saying if you believe that free will is defined as a choice between good and evil, and if you believe that you can retain free will in the eschaton, Origen just simply reasoned to the conclusion that you would have the ability to fall again. Because if you have free will in the eschaton, that means that you can choose something other than the one, and the only thing other than the one is non-being or a lesser good, and that's what the fall is, according to Origen. So the Platonic, Neoplatonic account of the fall, especially in Origen, it literally is that in our pre-existent state, we took our gaze away from the one, we looked into and enjoyed creatures, and that resulted in Adam and Eve falling and being put into a physical body. That's Origen's view. He believes in pre-existent souls and a fall into the physical world. Then we have to sort of transcend this state. Our bodies have to become spherical in his view, because that's the perfect shape, right, to retain perfection. That then we have to move out of change and back to perfect stasis. So there's a dialectic in the position of Origenism coming directly out of Neoplatonism and Greek philosophy, that there's a dialectical opposition between stasis and change. Change being bad, stasis being good. One being good, many being bad. This is just fundamental Greek dialectics. And this affects many people in the first 1,000 years of the church. Even saints still get affected by this. Dr. Patrick has a great point about how even in the midst of St. Maximus refuting Origen on these points in the Ambigua, still falls into the mistake of thinking that the Adam and Eve had some sort of unitive existence prior to the fall that was better, and that having two genders is a lesser state. I don't think that that's true, and not every church father thinks that's true either. So there's actually, again, there's disputes and disagreements amongst the church fathers on all of these kinds of issues. And Ubi himself has, in many of his videos, pointed this out. There's not one universal ruling in every single case for things in people's lives that are difficult, that might involve marital problems, for example. That's why the Orthodox Church doesn't have a one-size-fits-all view of marriage and annulment. And then the irony is that the Roman Catholic position itself has evolved in many cases as well. I mean, he just...
they claim that they need a universal formula that it applies to all people at all times, that's invariant, abstract, universal, and invariant. And then what does it do? Just the opposite.
It's whatever the Pope decrees at that time. So
at that time,
right. So basically, Casti Connubii and Humana Vitae literally do not have a backing in the patristic period, because the arguments that are made on the purpose for the purpose of sexuality, that it's restricted to only procreative intentions, right? If you want to take the Augustinian view, it's extremely rigorous, right? He basically thinks that not only do you have to be open to the possibility of life, that you have to actually have the intention to have an offspring in every sexual encounter. And if you don't personally have that intention, you are in sin, right? And that's why he thought that was almost impossible at all times. So how could you have marital relations that didn't in some way involve sin? And it's just not...
So does everybody see that, by the way, that just to connect to your previous point, if you believe, and this is what, why one would come up with an absolute divine simplicity and the notions, as you so aptly put, about what will is. If you believe there's only one good, then it's either or. It's either the good or it's the evil, right? The lack of good, the lack of being. And so with respect to this, like to marital acts of, I don't want to get some conjugal marital acts, let's say, that in that system, you're going to have to say there's only one and only one good. So anything else that's accompanying or in that would obviously be a sin. Whereas in the Orthodox position, that there's a good of procreation, and there's other multiple goods too that you could enjoy or participate in, and therefore you're not sinning. I just wanted to make sure that
think about it in terms of the problems of the body and the soul, right? So in the West, you get a very negative view eventually towards the body, because the body is viewed in a Platonic way, that it's the prison of the soul. So I should punish my body, right? And they come to the wrong conclusion that asceticism is mortification, that I should mortify my flesh and punish it or whatever. But that's based on a misunderstanding of the word. It's not Paul wasn't using the word flesh to describe the physical body. He was using it as a descriptor of the fallen state of humanity in terms of the passions. And the passions themselves, as St. Gregory Palamas says, aren't even themselves inherently bad. That's why Christ can assume the blameless passions.
Blameless passions.
Right. So it's not desire that's bad, and it's not will that's inherently bad. Even the faculty of willing is not inherently evil. And that's why the church fathers will say that if you think about the demons and the devil, not even the devil's nature or will itself is evil, because God gave him those things. But the difference is that those beings chose to continually will the wicked and the evil, and like humans in the eschaton that are wicked, they will be perpetually willing bad and evil things. But the problem here is that because there's a hierarchy between the soul and the body, certainly the soul is higher, and many church fathers say should be given importance above the body. That doesn't make the body evil and bad. And so many ascetics and so many people in the history of the church fell into Origenistic problems and problems where they would see that the body is the problem. This is what motivates Origen to castrate himself, right? Well, if I struggle with lust, I should cut off my genitalia. And then, of course, he finds out that the problem with lust is not the genitalia. The problem is an inner disordered desire, the passions that have to be healed in a certain way, and that healing can't be through something like that. It can't be through mutilation. It can't be through external means. It's a requirement of healing that comes through the uncreated grace of the church and the sacraments, right? That's why Christ has a law that he wants us to keep, and we can't keep that, but he also then gives us the uncreated power to then keep it, you see. So it's a
now I'm gonna cite some modern pagan film to make this point. You know what that illustrates this point? And actually, it's a book that was then done into film, but Clockwork Orange. So notice you have corrupted individuals, degenerates. And then what does the state and the scientific community actually try to do? They think they can cure the evil by correcting all the externalities.
Yes, exactly.
And then in the end, it shows it doesn't actually work. You can't actually, because the issue is a spiritual issue. It's not externalities. So you could cut everything off. You could remove your body. You can play Beethoven's Ninth with your eyes open and, whatever else. It's not going to fix the problem.
So he gets drugged. He gets put through a conditioning process of operant conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. It's all behaviorism.
Yeah, that's right. That's
so excellent. They engage in because the assumption is that man is a tabula rasa, and the only reason he does X, Y, Z is because he was programmed to do it through his external stimuli. So we'll just input new external stimuli, and that'll fix the problem. Of course, that's just assuming a certain view of anthropology that's false. Man is not a blank slate meat sack tabula rasa. Man has a soul, a spirit, right, which that also can give rise to disordered addictions, passions, and desires. And so man requires more for his healing than external stimuli. And that's why all that is another approach to locating evil in some ontologically existing thing, right? I mean, it's modern people don't believe in evil, but they'll just think, well, what we call evil is just some psychological problem that we developed from infancy or something, right? Freudianism, psychoanalysis, or whatever the dominant theory today is. I know those are dead theories, but those are all versions of secular approaches to man that don't take into account, well, I guess to be fair, psychoanalysis at least gives credence to the notion of a psyche or a soul, so it's not totally materialistic, but it's still ineffectual because it doesn't have any weight. I mean, it's all stupid when you get into like the idea of integrating your dark side. Why would I integrate something that, number one, doesn't have existence or being, and number two, might have its origins in the demonic, right? So I need to integrate.
That sounds like a real bad idea.
Yes, I need to integrate the demons into me, right? Sorry, Carl Jung, that's not a good idea, but
and then you have to pay them for doing it.
But yeah, I think that one thing that I didn't realize when I was a Roman Catholic or a traditional Catholic, reading a lot of Augustine and a lot of these things, was the limitations and the problems in Augustinian theology. And that was it took me a long time. It took many years, and it was difficult for me to swallow that pill. But eventually I had to be honest with, this is just what is the scholarship has shown this. I read enough.
And by the way, none of us fall into the dialectic. I can speak for Jay and myself on this. we love Augustine. He's a saint of ours. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have issues in certain, he's really good on some stuff. He's, so don't fall into it's an either or on the Augustine issue too.
So in the Fifth Council, it explicitly says that the anti-Manichaean writings are essentially of dogmatic status, right?
Yeah.
The Fifth Council says you can read Augustine's anti-Manichaean writings for a perfect expression of orthodoxy. Now, you notice they didn't include all of his writings, right? So not everything is listed there, but specifically the anti-Manichaean writings, and certainly other writings too have, you often mention the Enchiridion, which was something I read that was really influential to me as well when I was
on Christian doctrines. Another
yeah. Well, that's the Enchiridion, right? So, coming out of Calvinism into Catholicism, I read a lot of those works. I read all the anti-Pelagian works, all the anti-Donatist works. They all were very influential, but I didn't realize that these topics of nature and grace get very precise and specific as theology moves on. And that's the next point I want to make is that we should then look at nature, grace, and in the Orthodox view, this is going to be difficult for Roman Catholics, but in the Orthodox view, we think grace is natural to man. And that sounds weird when you hear that, because the Roman Catholic view is so used to thinking of it in this two-tiered thing, and they're kind of
added on to nature.
Yeah, and they're kind of like almost in tension, especially in the Augustinian view. The will has to almost be overcome for man to be saved or replaced. That's why efficacious or irresistible grace or whatever is necessary in the Augustinian scheme, because the will of man just can't do that, and it's almost like it's in a natural tension against God, right? But we don't think that. We believe in synergeia, and I know that Augustine thinks that once grace moves, the person can be involved in synergeia, but it's more clear in the Christology of the Orthodox Church in what sense the human energy and will is never supplanted or destroyed. It's always there, and it's always involved in the synergeia, even at the point of conversion. And so there's a natural willing and energy that we would hold that man never loses, contrary to the Calvinist or the Lutheran, I should say Luther himself. Because Luther, you notice, he actually takes the Augustinian view of you're either loving God or the devil to the extreme. I mean, Luther says you're an ass that is either ridden by God or the devil. So you're either literally controlled by God or you're controlled by Satan. So, and that's it. It's his famous quote in Bondage of the Will. The whole book is about that, basically. So I'm parsing out the different specific positions here. Now, Augustine's position is a little more nuanced than that. He doesn't think that human will is ever lost. He never denies free will or the energy or the movement of the human will, but he does think that there's for conversion that it's almost necessary, because we're so fallen, that there has to be this kind of like irresistible or efficacious grace. He uses the term operative grace. Operative grace is necessary to infallibly convert us, and then cooperative grace is necessary for us to synthesize or synergize with in the process of salvation. Then he believes the fixed number of the elect will be given the unmerited gift of perseverance by which they are infallibly saved. But when it comes to his approach to nature or natural law, he's not a Calvinist, and I would say in a lot of ways he approaches closer to the Orthodox or the position of St. Maximus, because by the time of the retractions later on, he doesn't think that natural law is like this autonomous domain. So he actually doesn't have a Thomistic approach to illumination or natural law, and this is pretty well known. I don't think I'm saying anything that controversial, that Aquinas and Augustine have differing views of what happens in conversion and illumination. Although Augustine is not as consistent as we would like him to be about the notion of divine illumination, he does seem to think that all of reality and the process of conversion itself does include this direct illumination of the individual via God. Now, I think he's inconsistent when he talks about created grace, but he thinks that it is something that the individual can experience. And I think he thinks, especially the later mature Augustine, that reality is theory-laden and Christological. You can't really get away from. In other words, he wouldn't think that you could autonomously interpret the natural world without divine revelation. And that's something I think he would find more commonality with St. Maximus than he would with somebody like Aquinas.
Agreed. Yep.
Well, so if that's the case, then let's get into the nuance of how does that view of the good and natural law or natural theology, to use that loaded term, how would that apply to how we would then view pagan art, pagan literature, pagan stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, right? How might that affect the way that we view people outside the church still in some sense possessing the good?
Yeah, it's exactly as you said too. I mean, it's all about your presuppositions. If you have a presupposition that there's this dialectical tension between nature and grace, that there's something, what is it that we always warn people? There's no such thing as sin nature. Sin nature, is our nature is still good. Our will, as you had pointed out too. And so you don't have to fall into this dialectics that I have to be regenerated. So it's an either or. Everything that I do and will is, and they'll read the St. Paul incorrectly, right? According to their paradigm lenses. If you already believe that, then you're going to read St. Paul. It says the good that I will to do, I don't, and the thing that I don't want to do, that I do. That there's this tension, right? That they'll read that in. And therefore, you have to be regenerated. You have to be, what was it? Augustine uses this operational grace that has to kind of move you in the beginning. But if pagans and non-Orthodox, the non-baptized, don't have that, then you fall into this kind of dialectic of that there's no worth in it. It's bad.
Yeah,
their will's bad. Right. Their nature's bad.
This would be a good question that we could ask St. Augustine, that, and later Calvinists will they will take that position to an even more rigorous view, where the Calvinists will basically say, you ask, well, can a pagan love his son? Can a pagan do something that isn't sin? And the Calvinists would have to say, no, actually, any action that any pagan or unregenerate person does is necessarily going to be in some way tainted or affected by sin, or in some way sinful.
And what do they always quote? The scripture, no man does good, no, not one. Right?
Well, but they also, in that same chapter, Romans 2, Paul says that when pagans do by law what is according to the moral law, they can be excused because they've done the correct or right action, or they can be accused if they've done wrong. So what that assumes is that, number one, Paul is not speaking as if every action is sinful. There is the possibility of keeping the law even as a pagan. And just think about how, when the church fathers appropriate, for example, the four classical virtues of antiquity, right? When they appropriate temperance, justice, prudence, and fortitude, which they do. Ambrose has entire lectures where he appropriates these pagan virtues. It's not that they're virtues because they're from pagans or paganism. As St. Maximus says, all virtues are Christ himself.
From God.
Mm-hmm. Right? So if a pagan has virtue, it's because he has that from Christ, even if he doesn't know that. You see.
By the way, can I just tell the audience
Can I
make one more point
before you say that?
Yeah.
And to be very clear about when we say Christ is virtue, there's uncreated virtue and created virtue. There's uncreated good and created good. There's uncreated love and created love. There's uncreated energy and created energy in our creatures. When I do an act in my human nature, I possess created energies proper to my created nature. I also possess created goods, right? They're not bad because they're created goods. Idolatry is the key point here, which is the misdirecting of my worship to something created. If I worship created things and give them the status of divinity when in fact they're not, that's what idolatry is. And we all have idolatry because of the fall, in the sense that we all have misdirected desires and we fail to worship God as we should, right? So we're all, in a sense, idolatrous. We're all sick from the disease of sin. But it doesn't mean that a pagan or a person outside the church can't have a genuine love for their children, or that they can't do a genuinely good action or deed. But if we want to understand how that's possible, and I would say it's still only by the Holy Spirit that even that is possible, right? That doesn't mean that their created actions are identical to the Holy Spirit, but the gifts of created goods also come from Christ and the Holy Spirit. Even the created goods that we possess are not our own. They're still gifts from God too. And so there's a question that where Maximus actually deals with this at the last hymn, where he says, well, how is it that outside the church, the Holy Spirit works, but we wouldn't say that outside the church, people possess the Holy Spirit in the same way that the people in the church do? And he says that's where mode comes in. The mode in which the Holy Spirit exists in the church and theosis is different from the mode in which he exists in the natural world, but it's still the Holy Spirit. And it's still...
Well, think about it this. We say the Holy Spirit is present everywhere and fills all things. And we say, God's omnipresence. And then people go, well, why come I got to go to church to take the Eucharist if God's everywhere, right? Well, the mode, right? That Christ exists in a special mode in the Eucharist. Yes, he's omnipresent. Okay, but he exists in a special mode in the Eucharist. The divine energies of God exist in a special mode in icons that they may not exist in, the tree or something like that. So that's excellent
exactly. And you make this, you always give the analogy of, well, think about when Christ was on earth. Is Christ omnipresent? Yeah, and the Gospel of John, the New Testament makes that clear. But it's also true, it's not an either or, it's also true that he's over there in Jerusalem in a unique way. Right? It's about
and not in Damascus when he's in Jerusalem.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And there is then, if you think about it, so were the people in Damascus, were they immediately benefiting from the people who grabbed his cloak and were healed? No, the woman that grabbed his cloak and felt the power go out from him, she got a special blessing that people in Damascus didn't get, you see.
Yep.
And so in the same way, yeah, Christ is present everywhere, but there's still a unique presence and mode of God's existence in things like the liturgy and the Eucharist. So it's a false either or, and we can use this analogy to help understand, if there's truth, and there's truths in pagan religions, there's truths in cultures outside of Scripture, absolutely. People discover things all the time, and ultimately any truth has its referent point ultimately back to God, but that doesn't mean that all truths are identical or that all goods are identical, or that there isn't a distinction between the grace in the church and the gifts that are proper to nature. And they can all be good, but different goods.
Bingo. And I want to say that what actually motivated this particular conversation was it 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago? Somebody, several people started accusing me of being an ecumenist. So let me kind of tell the story behind this. So Mark Wahlberg came out with a new film called Father Stu, which he plays a Roman Catholic priest from the city that I live in here. And so he's kind of a legend within the Helena community in Montana, well known. Now, Mark Wahlberg's a Roman Catholic, said to be a devout Roman Catholic. And he had come to our campus and he got a tour. And my philosophy students were all excited about seeing Mark Wahlberg. So when he came out of one of the buildings, we took a 10-minute break so that my students could meet and get, their cast and books autographed by Mark Wahlberg. And then I was invited to an early premiere of that movie, in which I got to meet Mark Wahlberg and introduce myself as Orthodox clergy. And these were posted, because it's my college, it's where I work at. Those photos were my philosophy students. And so immediately was like, what is Father Dcn Ananias posting Roman Catholic? And why is this person posting Father Dcn Ananias stuff in an Orthodox form? What's Orthodox about this? Only Orthodox. Well, I'm Orthodox, so that solves the problem right there. But they were accusing me of being an ecumenist. And I'm like, So why is it ecumenist? Because what a great blessing this was that I got to meet Mark Wahlberg and tell him that, about a little bit about Orthodoxy, and that I got to spend the rest of the evening at one of the after parties talking to Father Stu's dad, to the Roman Catholic priests, the people in that diocese about Orthodoxy. And, I'm proselytizing in some sense. I'm sharing the faith. And that makes me an ecumenist. So I had made this meme, and somebody had, the therapist has interviewed, like, everybody's an ecumenist according to these people, right? There's nothing you can do that doesn't. It's sort of like the thing racism, right? Like, I'm not, anything you say is just going to further validate, well, that's exactly what a racist would say. I felt the same thing. It was like, no matter what you do, everybody's an ecumenist. I'm the last true Orthodox left on earth, and I can interpret the canons and tell everybody. Again, it's just sort of kind of rigorism. And this person comes on to my page and starts saying that Orthodox shouldn't watch any non-Orthodox films. And then it goes a step further. This was like a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. No, Orthodox shouldn't read any non-Orthodox books. And then it got into this debate, right? So this is kind of what's motivating. And I said, well, he's like, the fathers say, who are you to go against the fathers, right? And he quotes, I forget what elder or father, and it ends up being about, don't get your theology from heterodox and heretical. It had nothing to do about whether you're allowed to read pagan literature, philosophy, and stuff like that. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. And I've noticed this, that some people, they become the same kind of hubris and individualism that certain Protestants can get about, well, I just go to, all I need is sola mea, right? Myself and scripture, right? That people get this way in Orthodoxy, this kind of rigorism, that I don't listen to my spiritual father because he's wrong. I don't listen to you. I don't listen to this Orthodox. Everybody's an ecumenist and modernist. And so it's left to me to read through the church fathers myself and interpret. Jay, have you noticed that? And this is what I was getting with this kind of rigorism. Yeah. I'm the laity, the last true Orthodox. Everybody else, and every Orthodox person and clergy members and the modernist ecumenist, I'm the last one. I'm the only one that can interpret the fathers correctly in the canons.
Yeah, I think David and I did a live stream about 2 or 3 years ago where we covered this idea of traps that we all encounter, and we talked about, obsessing over Romanides, reading everything through Romanides, David Bentley Hart and universalism as a trap, textual liberalism as a trap, a lot of different temptations that everybody in Orthodoxy can sort of be lured with. And one of those isn't just the liberal side, it's also the hyper-Orthodox side of, I'm a catechumen, I'm going to go read the Rudder, and I'm going to find all the places in the Rudder where people aren't following ancient canons and call everybody out. Right? And we've all seen this like many times with people that are new to Orthodoxy or new converts. So one of the things that initially kind of turned me off was that kind of an attitude, because it was like exactly what's the ethos of the traditional Roman Catholic world. It's the exact same spirit, which, as you said, is in a lot of ways similar to like a Protestant attitude of, it's just a different version of it. It's like, instead of as a Protestant or a Calvinist, me mining the scriptures to just find a way to one up or to call everybody out, it's like, now I'm just going to use the church fathers. Oh, now I'm going to use canon law. And the same thing can occur with lives of saints too. It's like, let me mine the lives of the saints to find this obscure passage about, what some medieval Irish penitential document said about what you can do in marital relations, written for monastics. And you're trying to, call everybody out on Twitter about this when you're 18 and you've never been married, right? I mean, can you speak to that? Because that's the thing that I see a lot, which is people, who are 18 and never been married, and they read the medieval Irish penitential about how you're supposed to only have sex in one position, and how you're supposed to, not have any, Can you speak to that? How that's number one, that's not your job, dude. You're not supposed to be policing the internet for people's sexual relations if you're an 18-year-old person who's never been married. That's for that person and their spiritual father. But I don't know why people feel the need to do this. It's bizarre to me. But could you speak to that?
Laity shouldn't be doing that at all. You don't have the authority to do that. You know, that's left to clergy, and we're trained. It doesn't mean that we all do it the best and we haven't made mistakes, but we're trained at actually how to approach that with the person, because there's, you know, you have to be mature. You have to know the kind of psychology of how people work, and that there's a lot of nuance in that, because our ultimate goal, and this is what people don't understand, is not orthodoxy is not about the rules. It's about healing, right? It's about healing our disorders. Ultimately, Christ healing and conquering death, but healing us that we may become more like him. So we don't take on this kind of rigorous, excessive judicial, pharisaical legalism. As I speak pharisaical legalism because there was somebody on our Discord that came in who was Jewish and was interested in orthodoxy. And we were asking, I don't know if you remember this, or was it in the Twitter spaces? I get the two mixed up. And we asked him, like, well, what's, you know, causing you to think about converting to Orthodox? And he says, well, in Judaism, there's no notion about achieving like spiritual virtues, the virtues, becoming like pious. It's about following the rules. You're God's chosen people, and these are the rules.
Yeah, he was saying rules for rules' sake. Yeah,
rules for rules' sake. And then he's like, that's what we do half of the time, is just rules for rules' sake, and the other half of the time is we spend all our time figuring out how we can break the rules while still keeping the rules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so it's like, well, dang, like that's the kind of stuff that people can bring in from different philosophies and faiths, traditions and stuff into orthodoxy, and that's not orthodoxy.
So let me
use them.
Let me give you the example of the one that I hear all the time, and I've heard it for years. I've heard this going back like 10 years. The ancient canons forbid you going to the theaters, and it's an excommunicatable offense. So if you went to see Star Wars, you need to confess that, or you should be excommunicated. What would you say to the zealous online super Orthodox person who says this?
Well, first of all, you're laity, and you're not supposed to be. You're not the interpreters or appliers of canon
This
law.
is so important. Yeah. Why is it that we as so you're trying to say I can't go read and understand the canon law? Why is it that this is such an issue?
Well, first of all, that you don't have the training. I mean, it's like, why can't I go and do heart surgery?
Well, read, yeah. First, I mean, you can't. Number one, like all of these canons can't even be kept. It's not even possible. I mean, a lot of these canons, like these cities and places, don't exist anymore. So that doesn't mean all of them. I'm not trying to denigrate the canons, but the point is that it's not a catechumen or a lay person's job to read this 1,000 pages of the rudder and try to tell everybody what is the right application of canon law.
Absolutely. And it's just a wrong understanding of what canon law actually is. That
it's pharisaical, right? I mean, it's a pharisaical approach.
Yeah, they're written. You might have to ask, like, why did they come up with this canon? And you'll find there was a particular issue that was going on, why that was written. Well, when they wrote that they have the intention, it doesn't matter what the situation, what time, or if things change as far as culture, you apply this at this stringency in all places, with all people, in all times. Do you really think that's actually how that is not the hospital notion analogy that we have within the church?
Right. It's like,
because, and
doctors
this is the exact,
of the soul. Why would we expect everybody to be a doctor? It makes no sense.
And second of all, that as doctors, medical doctors know that sometimes applying the medicine. And the reason why the medicine was created was to cure a certain disease and problem, but sometimes applying that medicine can actually do the opposite. This is why the analogy carried over into the Orthodox Church. Why do we have a kalamia? Because if you applied the law, then it would forfeit and contradict the end of the teleological end in which it's trying to achieve.
Exactly.
Love, healing, and stuff like that. So therefore, it's given to those who are trained, right, who have been given the authority, deacons, presbyters, bishops, to, and I'm not saying that the deacon is that, it's really the bishop, and then he instructs the priest, and then the priest instructs the deacon on what to tell the people. And we have that authority, but we've been trained in seminary on how to deal with interpersonal, right? How to understand the kind of history of this, the kind of ethos of the Orthodox Church in terms also of soteriology, what our model of salvation is as a healing. And so it's very much exactly like medicine, that the doctor is trained, hopefully sufficiently, to understand all these different things, and you don't apply the same medicine at the same time. And it's also a modern secular legal analogy too. The law is like written on the books is the maximum, but notice the judge is actually trained and is nuanced and hopefully has this kind of virtue, discretion and wisdom, has acquired these different things, just like the clergy should as well, to go, should I, this is a repeat offender versus a first-time offender. Here's what it says, the law. So I just have to apply that. I can't even look at the circumstances.
Also keep in mind too, I mean, in the biblical perspective, that position is not always, but usually reserved to someone who's elderly.
Yes.
It's usually expected to be someone who's older, who has the lived experience of the wisdom of applying the law, and not just some 20-year-old spurg who's applying the letter of the law. Because you need to have lived experience, right? And old people have seen a lot more than we have. That's why the scripture has in Proverbs, you are supposed to stand up and revere the gray-headed, silver-headed man because of his lived experience.
Yes.
He has something that you can't have as a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old. You don't have that yet. Doesn't mean you're bad. And sometimes there's exceptions. We know Timothy was a young man, and Paul said, don't let anybody, talk down to you because you're young. But that's the exception and not the rule. Typically, when we think of holy men, you think of elders, right? An Orthodox elder, and again, to stress your point too about law, I mean, Jesus makes this point to the Pharisees: the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The purpose of the Sabbath was not for you to be enslaved to a bunch of inane rules and superstition. This defeats the whole purpose of what it was there for, right? And the same thing can occur with canon law, or with I read Saint so-and-so, or another thing we see, you and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago, a person who's new to Orthodoxy or something, and they immediately want to take on the philokalia and try to force everybody into living this hermetic style existence. What's the problem with this?
Well, again, on the medicine analogy, or on an athletic analogy or something like that, that there isn't a one size fits all. These things are, as we'd say in philosophy, there's a difference between the status, of, for example, a fact or a moral fact as being objective, means it doesn't depend on you. And then when we say absolute, that has to do with the stringency, and if it's applied, how strict that's actually applied. So you could have something that is objective without it being absolute. Why? Because it may not apply to all people. That objective rule of, for example, there's probably an objective rule that you should care for one another. That may not take the same expression or the same degree of intensity in different cultures. It doesn't mean it's relative. It has to do with stringency. And so the problem is if you come off and say that, well, I think that these rules in the church, these canons have to apply to all people at all times at the exact same degree, then you're going to get major problems, right? So ask your question again, because I was just going somewhere.
So for example, I remember, I want to say it's Saint Nikolai Velimirovich or somebody in that vein. I can't recall, but there was an introduction that they had written to a treatise on spiritual virtues and spiritual works and monastic life. And
I remember.
And they actually said at the beginning of the work, this is not for everybody to start with. He actually said something like, if you are new to Orthodoxy or if you're living the lay life, this isn't the book for you. And I've always remembered that, because many people think, oh, well, now that I've converted,
one size fits all, yeah,
it's my job then to think of the analogy of like a spiritual a person who's advanced in this, right? You don't immediately jump to trying to run the most difficult marathon if you're,
well, that's the analogy I want to use. Like, yeah,
you don't immediately try to play
lifting
Beethoven.
weights. I'm going to bench 200 or something. You're going to get hurt. So if working out is to promote, if the teleological end is to promote health and strength, then if you did a one size fits all, well, everybody should be lifting 200, benching 200. And then it actually defeats the whole purpose, because you hurt yourself or kill yourself, like depending what you're due. That's the exact same thing. That's why it's not up to laity to tell how these rules, how you're supposed to fast, or what you're supposed to be doing ascetically. You're not supposed to tell that to anybody. And
it's also not
spiritual fathers.
It's also not anybody else's job to go around the internet policing and telling everybody how to keep the fast and what they're doing wrong.
Yes. So the wise spiritual father, the elder, who spent time, just like a doctor knows your medical history, will know, okay, you're at this level, this is what I need to apply. Now, as you get more advanced, you'll increase your spiritual weights, but that's not for you to decide. That's your spiritual father, somebody who knows you spiritually better than you know yourself. And so this is why, it's discouraged or, warned about, if you're a neophyte, don't go read in the Philokalia the stuff that's about like monastic rules and stuff like that. And people, you don't realize that you're actually being fooled and tempted by the devil, right? Because think about it, the devil's temptation, he speaks of something true and good, but then he perverts it, right? Because if it was completely false and wrong and evil, nobody would fall for it. So in the garden, he says, well, don't eat this. For the day that you eat it, you will become, the reason why God doesn't want you to eat it is because the day you eat this, you'll become like God, knowing good from evil. Well, that's what we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to become like God. So there's a bit of truth in that. But what was the temptation? You can have it like this. You can get to the top.
Yeah, shortcut.
Do it your own way and do it fast. And this is the same temptation that people on the internet and neophytes, the last true Orthodox left on earth, are actually doing. They want the top without the hard work, and they want it now and on their terms. And that's you don't realize, like, you just got tricked by the devil. And so, no, you've got to work up, and you don't do it on your own. You listen to your spiritual father.
Yeah.
And so it may not be, for example,
right.
One of everybody, when they first convert, and to be fair, it's like, we're so excited, right? You see what orthodoxy can produce. You see these people holding all night vigils and praying, the hours and stuff like that. And you're just like, wow, like, I want to be like that. And so I'm taking on myself to actually do that. And you want to do these long prayers and hold all night vigils and stuff like that. But you're doing it all by yourself. You're still a Protestant. And the devil's got you exactly where he wants you, because he wants you to do stuff by yourself, right? And so this is why a priest and a spiritual father would say, let's start you off small. It's better to be small and consistent. They'll start you off on a prayer rule. You can add further stuff, other prayers, but your rule is the thing that you never break. Let's start you off just saying the Trisagion. Every morning or every evening, you'll do the Trisagion. That's your rule. You stay consistent with that. We can add stuff later. We can add the weights. Otherwise, you're going to burn out. And you're not supposed to be doing, you should be getting a blessing from your priest to be doing. Should I be doing the hours? Should I be praying? Okay, you can't decide that stuff on your own. I mean, you can, but you're going to suffer the consequences of. So what do you want to do? Do you want to be healed?
And by the way, I made all these mistakes. I mean,
I did too, yeah.
And I still, I think after a while you start to realize, like, I need to continue to figure out how to do the basics, right? Like,
don't go online too and be like, oh man, I'm so good at praying the hours. Hey, is everybody going to pray the hours? Hey, I'm so good at, is everybody else going to be holding the all night vigil with me and stuff like that? That's where the scripture is actually talking about when you pray, go in your room, right?
Yeah, I've never, the reason I don't pray on stream, and I'm not knocking anybody that does it, is that it's just always come off to me as just, it doesn't, to me, it just doesn't feel right, but that's me. I'm not calling into question anybody's motives that does it. I don't care about judging people's motives, but just the sort of the display element of it, I think, is something that should be avoided. And by the way, in my own defense too, I think, you know, people that follow this channel a lot, I don't give people personal spiritual advice. I get a lot of messages and comments, people wanting me to help them with their.
You're always really good to direct them to.
I always say, you need to go talk to these people. You need to talk to your spiritual father. That's not my role. It's not my job. It's not my, I mean, I shouldn't. I'm trying to get the basics down myself, right? So I'm not in that position. And I wanted to mention that Jim Jatras had a really great point in the chat. Shout out to Jim. He says, in regard to old guys and their awareness of sin, he says, if you remember in the case of those who were ready to stone the adulteress, Christ rebuked them, and it says in the text that the oldest left first. They left because they were more conscious of the sins when they were older. They remembered.
Excellent point.
And he says, if you think about it, that implies that the self-righteous young people were the ones that were ready to throw the stones. And that's definitely true. As I've gotten older and I look back on my, mid-20s age self, I think about just how prideful and self-righteous I was. And I didn't even realize it. You don't even realize how you have the log in your eye as you're, trying to call everybody out and police the internet or whatever you're trying to do. That's ridiculous, right?
I have a friend that's, and Ryan, if you're watching, hello. Oh, and Mark Wahlberg, if you're watching, call me. No, Ryan, if you're watching, he had my friend who's going to be
come on, got your good vibration.
He's going to be baptized and received in the church. A lot of friends I grew up with.
You got to convert Marky Mark now. You got to convert.
Yeah, I know. It's I only had a few minutes alone with him. It was really hard. Give me a break.
Like you had like 5 seconds to be like, are you aware of the absolute divine simplicity problems in the Roman Catholic?
Yeah.
You had 5 minutes to get it.
Filioque implies.
Yeah, do you know what the filioque implies?
Yeah, that would have been hilarious. I'm just messing the essay.
But then you should go on the line and be like, I totally called out and owned Marky Mark on the filioque. Boom.
Maybe I should have done like the Vato version. Like, orale, eh? You know the implications of divine simplicity, eh? No, I'm just fooling, but seriously, eh? Like, have you thought about it? Articulator, but seriously, I'm going to call you up and I'm going to see you in your house and talk about the filioque. He might have responded well to that. Anyways, back to my friend who's being received and baptized in the church, along with a lot of friends that I grew up with at Calvary Chapel. Praise God. We just baptized my dear friend, my new godson, Lazarus Saturday. And I want to just give a shout out to all those who received into the Orthodox Church. We're praying for you. Those who received on Lazarus Saturday. But anyways, going back to my friend, he said something really interesting because he was, sharing some stuff with me, and he was saying, I don't do I try not to do this. And I said, yeah, that was my mistake. This kind of hubris and zeal without knowledge.
Yeah, I remember when in a real quick interjection, when I was 18, 19, and I was like a super hardcore evangelical when I first started reading the Bible and converted, I went through this little phase where I thought, I had like 300 CDs of secular music, right? All kinds of stuff. And a lot of it was definitely, degenerate type of music. And I had a lot of, VHS movies of all these different movies. And I went through this phase where I thought, God is calling me to throw away all these things. And I will say that for me at that time, it was a good thing because they were in a way idols to me, because that's what I filled my time with, was a bunch of pop culture. And then when I got a little more mature and I realized actually those things weren't the problem. It was good. It was necessary for me to go through that purgation period of getting rid of a lot of those things. But as I got a little more mature in my theology and my thought process, I realized, well, actually, it's not those things that are the problem, right? Idolatry isn't primarily this object or that thing. It's a problem in here. And so we all, I think, have that phase where or many of us do, where we think that was the problem, and if I can get rid of that in everybody else's life, it'll solve the problem. But it's actually just missing what the problem is, right?
Yeah. And I say these things because, like parents would say to their children, because we actually care. Learn from our mistakes. Don't do this because it's in the end going to harm you and other people. So I'm not saying this in a legalistic way. Don't do this. I'm better than you. We fell for those, we had those issues. And I do appreciate when people like my brother and my friend Ryan and other people can look at that and learn, be like, okay, yeah, that wasn't good. And I don't want to do that. And that's all we're trying to say.
Well, I think, yeah. So the point though, is idolatry is not primarily a thing or a bodily movement, but I mean, it can be expressed by, if I bow down to the idols, but the problem of idolatry is in the heart and in the mind. It's revering and treating the created things as if they are God or ends in themselves, but that doesn't make any of the created things evil. Now, next thing I want to come to is that theoretically people could misuse this principle and say, oh, well, if everything is inherently good, then anything I do could be conceived of or construed as in some way good, right? Like, oh, I guess I should watch, the X-rated, whatever thing, because I mean, human sexuality is good in itself, right? So let's put it this way. So there are rights and wrongs, but not everything is black and white in this regard, right? Obviously watching openly prawn stuff is not good. That would be a sin. But at the same time, you can't have a sort of a one size fits all thing like, oh, any story involving violence and sex, that is inherently evil. Well, that would be, so we can't read the book of Judges. I mean, it's full of that, right? So it's the context, right, and other elements that would dictate, like, when is something, let's say pagan literature, that might be, what's the word, that it might contain vices as well as virtues, right? In other words, you'd have to take it by a case-by-case basis, right? I mean, there's no one size fits all. How would you respond?
Yeah, maybe you might be. Well, I was just thinking about too how ridiculous this would be. Like when I was arguing with this guy online a week and a half ago, so we have to throw out liberal arts programs, the great books, which is what many of our saints, right, St. Maximus and St. John Chrysostom and different people actually studied, and was carried through, up until just recently, because they're pagan or like there's nothing to be learned. And some of that stuff borderlines raunchy. I remember in the great books, like you read Aristophanes, So we have to look and be like, well, clearly there are things too far, like as far as like how is it really, really blatantly promoting debauchery, and there's so little good in it that would be so corrupting that it's not worth watching. There are going to be things like that, obviously, like, and also, again, this is something you need to talk to your spiritual father about. Well, what sort of disposition am I? Like, am I the sort of person that could watch that and that, there might be some violence in a movie or read some violence in a book where that would be harmful for me?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're a Vietnam vet who could get triggered by violence on a movie or something, right? Or even perhaps you could read something that's violent and can trigger you. I mean, literature can be just as moving and traumatizing in a way as something that's visual could be, potentially. So the point is that you just can't have these sort of hard and fast rules, like, or the idea that, oh, anything that is secular is bad. Well, yeah. What does that mean exactly? I mean, how would we cash out what is specifically, quote, secular? Anything that's not produced by an Orthodox Christian? I mean, so basically nothing. I mean, like, you got Dostoevsky and nothing else. I mean, what about Tolkien? What about Tolkien? What about C.S. Lewis? I mean, those are, really well done. They're not Orthodox.
Well, if there's anything I learned from this gentleman online, it's that I actually need to burn my Bonolo book on non-Euclidean geometry. That reading these formulas here.
Well, yeah, I mean, Pythagoras, Euclid, they were all pagans. So it was math.
Yeah, this guy's not a Christian, so we can't.
Math is satanic.
And this is what the person was saying. All I need to know from you is that I got all I need to know from you by seeing heterodox people agreeing with your position, which ended up he prejudged this person was actually an Orthodox person that grew up with elders, and then says, well, you could have fooled me because you went to Baptist seminary for undergraduate. So do you see this kind of rigorism? Like, it's this, and dialectics, you can't read anything. You can never agree. So I can't agree with any mathematician unless they're Orthodox. I guess because I went to Thomas Aquinas College prior to becoming Orthodox, I'm not a true Orthodox. This person, for whatever reason, maybe they got funding. Maybe that was the only place at the time that they could actually go to. Maybe they got the blessing from their spiritual father. Does that so it makes this lay person the ability to actually judge who's Orthodox based on what school they went to?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
Do you see how destructive this is?
Well, let's look too at the life of, so everybody knows St. Photius was the most learned man of his day. He became the Patriarch of Constantinople. I think wasn't he was a deacon, and like he wasn't even, like he went from deacon to patriarch. Isn't there a controversy about that? I mean, and if you look, he was the most prolific writer of his time. He wrote a book that I don't think is translated, maybe it is, but it's called the Bibliotheca, and it's the book where he reviewed 279 of the prominent books of that day. And if you look at the list of the books that he reviewed, it's all kinds of stuff, right? So he included reviews of pagan Greek authors, Greek statesmen like Aeschines. I'd never even heard of him. He reviewed Cassius. He reviewed Iamblichus, the ritual magician Neoplatonist. He reviewed Damascius, the Neoplatonist. He reviewed the Manichaean works of Agapius. And so, I mean, the saints and the theologians of the church don't even live up to these ridiculous standards of these, zealots who have a zeal without knowledge, is the best way I could put it.
And I know some people are going to make a counter argument that, well, aren't you just wasting your time? I mean, if the richness of the fountain is up here and all the theological works, then you're dividing your time and wasting it when you could be doing, and that's a sin itself too, they'll say. But again, that goes back to what we were saying, that, well, only if you have a view that there's only one good.
Exactly.
And you're in this dialectics between the one good, and anything less is a falling away from the good and towards evil. That, again, you would fall into the same trap as the utilitarian. That any time
Well,
that
this
I
is why
spend time
Augustine
with my
says,
family or go on vacation, I'm immoral. Because I'm not maximizing, I'm not making.
Well, this is the
decisions.
reasoning of Augustine, right? This is why St. Augustine says that he has a really hard time with how marriage can be good. Because if it's not if the ideal is the single celibate state and marriage is a lesser good, how could it be good? And clearly he struggles with this throughout his writings. And Ubi, again, proved that in the video today. Right, so we're not trying to knock him as if he's a bad person. I mean, we were just extolling him earlier in ways that he's actually more in our camp in terms of divine illumination as opposed to the Roman Catholic camp. His view of natural law would be more in line with us than with the Roman Catholic view. So I'm not trying to knock him or say that he's bad, but clearly he got things wrong. I'm sorry, but there's just, we have to be honest with the fact that the church fathers are not always unified on everything. And some overzealous so-called Orthodox people think, I've heard this too, the church fathers didn't disagree. And if you think there's disagreements in the church fathers, you are a liberal, because liberals say that the church fathers, you're a modernist. How would you reply to that? You're a modernist. You say the church fathers disagreed. They didn't disagree.
I'd say, I have to ask, are the modernists in the room with us right now?
You're right. I mean, it's just factually not the case, right? I mean, the church fathers didn't have the same canon of scripture. I mean, and this is debated for centuries. So
exactly. That's a great point. And that's not how our ecclesiology works, right? That, like, again, it's a human divine institution. Yes, we have normativity. We have various levels of it. We do have a concept of infallibility. We have a concept of consensus paternum, right? But that's not it. It's not me. Like, every single point on these issues, the fathers agree on all things.
Yeah, and to be clear, those people will say, actually, no, we're talking about the saints. So, yes, some of the church fathers are not saints. So not all the church. No, but even the saints don't all agree. I mean, you can look at saints having differing canons of scripture. So clearly they didn't all have the same idea of, and clearly that's not what's necessary to be a saint, right? I mean, clearly the canon of scripture is part of Revelation. So, I mean, they didn't get it all right. And that's not a big deal. Like, why is that even a problem? Why is the expectation that they wouldn't have disagreements even? I don't even understand why this is something that they feel, some overly zealous Orthodox people feel the need to defend that. I don't understand why. I think they feel.
And by the way, you cited the council that said what stuff of Augustine
the
is
fifth council,
actually dogma. What's that?
The fifth council, yeah.
In the fifth council, why didn't they just say, well, it's all good?
Right. A good point.
It's all dogma, right? If their point is true, then they could just verify.
Oh, that's exactly.
Augustine is a saint, right? So why didn't they say that? If all the saints,
well, I mean, if you read Saint Photius's Mystagogy, he's like, Augustine got things wrong. so there's a saint telling you that saints can get things wrong. I mean, it's very clear. Photius says that in the Mystagogy. But so I wanted to just point out, if you read there's a couple good quotes in the Pelicon section about the good and how the Cappadocians appropriated different philosophical ideas in the Hellenic view, the tradition, the Hellenic philosophers, and what about the good? And he's talking about virtue. And virtue in the Greek is arete. I don't speak Greek, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's arete. And it's usually translated as either virtue or excellence, or perhaps moral excellence. And since God, of course, is the good, the Cappadocians would employ, St. Gregory of Nyssa says, whatever is good is from God. Whatever is kalon is also from God. Again, emphasizing this point that any goods, whether uncreated, whether created, they all have their origin in Christ, who is the source of all good. The effect of participation in the good, and the church fathers are adamant that all things, all beings, everything that has being, participates in some way or some mode in the good, namely in God, but in different ways and in different modes. This participation is likewise paradoxical, for it is possible to make the desire for the good and for participation in it an article of a kind of natural theology he's talking about. He's not talking about the Roman Catholic view. He's talking about how the Cappadocians appropriate the theology of nature as something automatically inhering to the human nature. As such, this aptitude for the good was seemed to be present in some people by nature, and it was also viewed as a coordination with free will in order to bring the natural aptitude to its effect. And this nature then bears the divine image, and thus virtue is natural to man in this Cappadocian appropriation. And the reason I say that is that in the Roman Catholic scheme, that's not really the case. There might be natural virtues, but the natural virtues are distinct from the supernatural virtues, and the supernatural virtues are not natural to man, you see. That's an important distinction for Roman Catholic theology. But if you read St. Maximus, who follows the Cappadocian line of reasoning, he actually thinks that the virtues are natural to man. He doesn't have a hard delineation between natural and supernatural. In fact, because of the Logi doctrine, the natural virtues are supernatural and are also natural to man. There is still a distinction between nature and grace, but those natural virtues are also Christological, you see. So for example, St. Ambrose, when he appropriates the four virtues, temperance, justice, prudence, fortitude, guess what he links them to? He doesn't link them to a Thomistic catalog of the pagan virtues or virtues apart from revelation. He links them to the Sermon on the Mount. So the seeds of the Logos, that would be the seeds of the virtues, even in pagan philosophers, are still the seeds of Christ, is the point. They're not some other thing that's different from the revelation of Christ, you see. Oh, there's those natural virtues over there that the pagans might have, and they're okay. But then there's the Christian virtues over here that are different. Christ is the source of both.
St. Irenaeus, Logos Spermaticus, and talking about...
Right, well, it's Justin Martyr's the big emphasis.
Justin Martyr,
but, I mean, I think you can find the same idea in all the Eastern Fathers, and they would be applying it to truths. And I'm saying you can make the same point about virtues, that all virtues ultimately have their derivation from the Logos, the Logi.
Yes.
That's how Maximus doesn't fit into the scheme of natural virtues and then the supernatural virtues on top. That's not his scheme. The virtues that are natural to man are also virtues that are grace, you could say. So even though there's a distinction, the grace is still natural to man. Maximus's famous phrase is grace is natural to man. And that's really, in a Roman Catholic scheme, that makes no sense. There's no Roman Catholic who could say that phrase.
That gives me a great idea of making some merch. Let's get some of these quotes and we'll sell t-shirts on Patristic Faith. Nature is, what did you say? What was the quote again?
Grace is natural to man, St. Maximus.
Grace is natural to man. That'd be a great
Doesn't mean grace is identical to the gifts of nature, but it is natural to man to progress into the telos that the Logos had for him, clearly. In other words, you can't separate virtues in any sense from the Logos. That's the point here. It's all Christological in St. Maximus' scheme. And according to Dr. Sean Stidd, it's the same in St. Ambrose. So in other words, St. Ambrose has something closer to St. Maximus' view than anything in the Roman Catholic view. Because he makes the beginning of living the virtuous life baptism, right? So he appropriates.
Yeah, Dr. Stidd, that was a great. Yeah. If you're watching, that was a great article. We really in paper.
Yeah, I don't know if it's public, but if Dr. Stidd's paper is viewable in some public academia.edu or something, it's called Reflections on the Metaphysical Foundations of Christian Virtue Ethics, and it's just going into St. Ambrose's appropriation of the 4 pagan virtues. So, but as we come kind of to the end, or we're sort of wrap it up, I mean, this made me think of the way that, we have people appropriating stories that are like Virgil's Aeneid or the Odyssey or Iliad. I mean, there's a long history of people finding, symbolic meanings and structures in these forms of literature that point to Christ. I mean, when the Western monks were Christianizing the British Isles in early to middle English period, they would take the story of a lot of scholars believe that the story of Beowulf was Christianized, that it was an older sort of pagan legend that the monastics kind of tweaked and made it more and more Christian. And so there's a lot of examples of this, and all I'm saying is that it's a well-known thing, right? It's not a far-off, outlandish thing to point to the Sibyl, right? In fact, in this very section in Augustine, ironically, 2 different sections. In the City of God, yeah, so in book 4, chapter 25, for example, he talks about a kind of natural theology in the sense of Romans 1, where man knows in his heart that there's a God that he wants to worship, that's the true God, but at the same time he's pulled by his passions and by the idolatrous cultures that he's grown up in to worship false gods. And Augustine says this is this is the demons that are behind the pagan idolatry throughout the world. It's ultimately demons getting them to. And he says, and let me explain to you why you can't go to the theater. The theaters, he says, were included the demand of the gods from the worshipers who attended the theater. And then he goes on to cite Cicero to prove this. But this, Cicero asserts, is a fiction of Homer, who transferred human shortcomings to the gods. Would that he had transferred divine powers to us men. The serious-minded Cicero was justifiably displeased with a poet who imputed fictitious crimes to the deities. So in other words, he's using Cicero as a source to refute Homer, saying that Cicero's argument is correct. Okay, Cicero...
Oh, that's 26, book 426?
Yeah, 426. Yeah. And then he says... in song but these crimes are represented in speech and song and in actions of the stage shows, and shows that are put on in honor of the gods and are classed among divine matters by the most learned authorities. How is this so? Cicero ought on this point to cry out, not against the poet's fictions, but against the traditional institutions established by his ancestors. So he's just pointing, he's saying Cicero was right here to point out the absurdity of the way the gods act in Homer and in the theater. So I'm making multiple points here. I'm saying, number one, it's not wrong to go to the movies. That's not the point of this text or this castigation. The point is that in the ancient world, the theaters were intimately bound up with open demonic actions and worship. It was a religious action to go to the theater, and that's why it's in the canons, as I understand it. Right? It's not talking about going and watching Star Wars. I'm talking about. I don't like the new Star Wars, by the way, but you know what I'm saying. Like, it's not talking about, can you go watch a movie? There may be movies that you shouldn't go watch because they're degenerate. I'm not denying that. But at the same time, I'm also pointing out that Augustine had a vast knowledge of classical pagan literature. He taught this stuff. And typically, yes, he doesn't think it's very beneficial, but he doesn't have an all or nothing attitude that all of this is inherently bad. That's what I'm trying to get at. And he's even utilizing arguments in Cicero to point this out. It's the same reason why I can find truths in David Hume. David Hume is a degenerate atheist. But his true arguments and his use in apologetics has nothing to do with his personal character or his degenerate life, right? And I'm just saying, you see the same thing in Augustine. He's utilizing an argument from Cicero. He's saying even your own people can recognize that the gods act ridiculous, right? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, this issue came up last year, too, that I would probably recommend, I'm not your spiritual father, but if I were, don't listen to Billie Eilish. Not only because it's poor music, but she seems to clearly be putting out and promoting satanic stuff, right? So this person got in an argument with me about a year ago that, well, you've got to be kidding me. Billie Eilish is not. I don't know if she's literally worshiping the devil, but she's pretending to. Her lyrics are clearly. That would be a case where it's like, look, you probably shouldn't be actually listening to that unless you were doing some type of deconstruction of the music or something like that. Another person said, well, you listen to Billy Idol, and he's clearly a Satanist, just as satanic as Billie Eilish. And I'm like, I don't know. He seems like he's probably a degenerate and stuff like that. But correct me, anybody in the chat if I'm wrong. I mean, does he have clearly satanic lyrics that, like, I'm a fallen angel, come stuff is like obviously clear. You see the distinction there? And I think I get to that, because I don't want people to say that well, clearly there is pornographic stuff. Clearly there is artists promoting satanic stuff. And I think that you shouldn't be engaged in that. Then there's other stuff that, for example, it might have bad in it, but it's okay to listen to maybe Billy Idol, like there's good Billy Idol, even if he himself may be a degenerate, and I don't know what his actual religious.
Well, I just realized too, I've forgotten this section in book 10, chapter 22, 23. St. Augustine talks about how various Greek philosophers had even kind of had inclinations towards the Trinity. And he talks about the Platonic triad and how they were in a veiled way describing what we were referring to by the triune God, right? He says that Porphyry, a Platonist, by means of the principles that he could see, referred to God the Father and God the Son, whom he called in Greek the intellect or the nous of the Father. The Holy Spirit, however, about which he says nothing. He goes on to talk about Plotinus and how many things Plotinus was correct about. And he says, doubtless these people expressed as best they could what we believe, but they expressed it according to the limitations of their time and their inclinations. So, again, Neoplatonism is pagan, right? It's not Christian theology. But Augustine himself often said, I read that those people helped me move in the direction of Christianity. Now, I wouldn't advise people who are interested in Christianity to take the bypass route of getting into Neoplatonism. I'm not saying that that's the way to go about it. But Augustine himself says that these people helped him understand. And when you get over into his discussion about theodicy and evil as a privation, this comes about in book 12, all the way up through towards the end of book 12. Where he goes really deep into appropriating Neoplatonic ideas of privation for explaining evil. And most of the church fathers did that, right? St. Athanasius does the same thing. But you'll find this kind of, even though Augustine is very critical of classical learning, classical pedagogy, classical pagan authors, he oftentimes also cites them, appreciates them, and especially in the case of St. Jerome, I mean, there's almost a worship of Cicero, right? So it's just bizarre to take on these all or nothing attitudes. And I appreciate your point about Billie Eilish. I mean, I've heard a few of her songs. I don't typically listen to her, but I think that's a great example that you can't just make a sweeping judgment, right? It has to be a case by case basis. But let's see if I had any more. What do you think about, just to throw a kind of a curveball, what about the classic pagan prophecies of Christ? Now, we know that this is possible given that Balaam predicts Christ in Numbers, but what about the Sibyl? What about Virgil's fourth Eclogue, which are famous prophecies of Christ? Do you have any view on that?
Wait, isn't this in City of God? I mean, you guys really...
Yeah, there's a whole section on the Sibyl in that, and he thinks it's real. So yeah.
I mean, if you haven't got a chance, I know it's a big book. Mine's like 800 and some pages. But if you really can read this, it's amazing, because it shows how, exactly like you're saying, that things in the pagans, right, are all preparing, and this is kind of God's sovereignty too, right? Without and a synergism, even when men are intending evil, God's intending good. And then furthermore, even the little goods and seeds that the pagans have, it's all working towards Christ. It's all preparing without overriding people's free will. That's what at least the first part of the City of God's all about. Well, I really think people should read
He goes so far as to say that Cumean Sibyl is a Christian. This is book 18, sections 21, 22, and he's recounting the history of Romulus and Remus and the founding of Rome, and he gets into Aeneas, and then he talks about, on the next page, or a couple pages over, book 18, chapter 23, he says, the Sibyl, whether Erythrea or some people believe the Cumean Sibyl, has nothing in her whole poem relating to the worship of false or created gods or demons. In fact, she attacks the demons and the worshippers, and is evidently to be accounted among those who belong to the City of God. Lactantius inserts in her work some prophecies concerning Christ uttered by the Sibyl, though he does not state which Sibyl. So, it shouldn't even be controversial that, the typical attitude of the fathers is that not only if you can have pagan prophecies of Christ, like, clearly there's truths that aren't restricted to the canonical text of Scripture, or to people in the church. It's just kind of
what about the Magi?
Silly. Yeah, those are oftentimes referred to by a lot of fathers as well as people who, there's this idea that in Zoroastrianism, there's kind of like a lot of Christian predecessors. I'm not saying that Christianity is a Zoroastrian evolved outworking, but I'm saying that many church fathers will say that these Magi had to have had some notion of the star of the Messiah that they followed, clearly. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. I think I covered most of the things in my note. Romans 2, evil has no being. For reference to Paul's verse in Philippians 4:8, whatever is good, whatever is virtuous, meditate on these things. So Paul does mention the virtues.
Can you quote the Saint Basil?
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, Basil has a essay that he wrote called it's a two young men, how to profit from pagan literature. So if you want, everybody can look this up. It's a famous work online about the proper way to understand this kind of literature and pedagogy. And again, many church fathers were proponents of classical learning and pedagogy. They weren't opposed to it.
Just summing up, take what's good from the pagans and leave what's bad.
Exactly. Same, which is the correct attitude, not just to the literature in terms of like Homer, but to the philosophy too, right? It would apply to Plato as well.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, let's get to super chats. So we hit most of the points there, and I will split these with Father Deacon. No, that's not right. Brother Vladimir, $5. Can you do a video where you analyze the Declaration of Independence from Orthodox? That's hilarious. I don't actually know if they're joking or being serious.
But you got to do it. You got to do a Nick Cage.
I have to steal it first and then do it in the Nick Cage way. Traditional culture preservation, $5. I was having an argument with a Muslim, and they brought up the dead that were raised in the crucifixion at the end of Matthew. Yes, I'm familiar with this. Do we have any other documentation of this? Not to my knowledge, but the Gospels are a great documentation. What is the best argument against Islamic theology and Tawheed? Well, if you listen to the debate with Shabir Ali and Ezra Rashid, I make arguments about their view of Tawhid in both of those debates. So I would refer you to that debate. Aside from that, that's a very philosophical argument. In my view, the strongest argument against Islam is that it's not in continuity with previous revelation. So the Quran says that the books of the gospel, the books of the Torah are not in error. They are preserved by Allah, and that Islam is in continuity with those books. Well, clearly it is not in continuity with those books, and that's why later on Muslims had to appropriate the idea of higher critical errors in the Bible. But they didn't originally make this argument, and the Quran does not make this argument. It says otherwise. So that's the biggest, I would say, problem. And divine revelation, right? Deuteronomy says, for example, that any future prophet has to be in continuity with prior divine revelation. And so if Islam is going to admit the gospel, the Injil, and the Torah, and David's Psalms, etc., then it has to be consistent with the prior revelation. It's not. That's the easiest, best argument against Islam. Orthodox Prepper 350. Given the opportunity, Jay, Father Deacon, would you ever debate a New Ager or a New Age guru, Deepak Chopra, Wim Hof? In my experience, I've never seen any of them debate. I think I've seen one. Deepak Chopra has one debate. But New Agers typically don't debate because debate is not something that really makes sense with the New Age relativistic philosophy. What do you think, Father Deacon?
Yeah, I think that's right too. It's why you also you don't see typically Jews debate outside of Judaism too, for different reasons than New Agers.
Yeah, very rarely. And like Far Eastern philosophy too. Typically, they don't engage in a lot of debates with. J Poopy, $10. I'm reading Disputation with the Purists. I'm confused about gnomic will. If gnomic will is part of human nature and Christ assumed our fallen nature, or excuse me, our full human nature, how does gnomic will not possess a gnomic will? Well, because a gnomic will is proper to a created hypostasis, and Christ is not a created hypostasis. So the Sixth Council determines that Christ doesn't possess a gnomic will because for more than one reason. For one, sometimes the word gnomic will is referring to the mode of willing proper to fallen humans or to fallen hypostases, and sometimes gnomic will is referring to the mode of willing proper to a created hypostasis. So that means willing in time and space, willing from discursively from beginning to end, willing in a malleable, changeable way. Christ's will was not malleable and changeable. Christ did not learn new facts because he's a divine person. So the reason he doesn't possess a gnomic will mainly is because he doesn't possess a created hypostasis. And a mode of willing proper to a created hypostasis that wills in time is gnomic. And it's a descriptor of the fallen mode of willing. And Maximus says Jesus has neither of those. Number one, he's not fallen. And number two, he's not a created hypostasis. So that's why. And that's what the Sixth Council determined, agreeing with St. Maximus. If human, let's see, is it because of his divine nature that it could be argued that the natures mix? The natures don't mix. So that even though there's a deification of the human nature, and even though the uncreated energies raise and deify the humanity that he assumed, they don't mix in the sense of it producing a tertium quid, which would be the Monophysite type of position. So he's a divine person. He's not a created human person. There is no created human hypostasis or created person in Christ. And that alone is enough to tell us why he doesn't have a gnomic will. And the Sixth Council saying that he doesn't have a gnomic will proves that he's not a created human person. J Poopy, $10. What would y'all's quick and easy explanation be to an uneducated Roman Catholic about the filioque being incorrect? Shout out to Father Deacon, and I am eager to go to Montanica. I would say just read the Mystagogy, and Photius will explain that it's a dyad. And the Mystagogy is not very long. So the filioque leads to a dyad is the easiest way to say it, because it gives to the Son the unique property that picks up the Father, namely being the cause.
That's exact. It's crazy because at the after party, for the Fathers 2 movie, this is the exact question that some of the Roman Catholics were
Oh, wow.
arguing. Like, I mean, and some of these weren't erudite. They were just kind of run of the mill, Roman Catholics, and asked, they just didn't understand the filioque. And I'm like, well, let me just kind of boil it down, that it destroys the monarchia and collapses it into, it sacrifices the Trinity. So she says, you mean you Orthodox don't believe in the Trinity? I'm like, actually, we do.
No, we believe it in the right way.
We're arguing against the filioque,
Yeah,
right? We're trying to preserve the Trinity and not collapse it into a dyad.
Right. So again, to the person in the chat who's making a big deal about Dionysius citing Proclus, yeah, but you notice that he Christianizes these ideas. St. Maximus Christianizes the Logi doctrine. And we just did a 2.5 hour live stream about how there's truths in everywhere. So why would to come in here and say that we're all just copying Platonism is just ridiculous. Just ban this person. This is a waste of time. Let's move on. Palantir $3. J. Father Ananias, how can you experience joy in heaven? Don't you have knowledge of the damned? Wouldn't it be a cause for suffering if we knew that our loved ones were lost? Yeah, I think a lot of church fathers deal with this, and they talk about the fact that we will also have a knowledge of the justice of God. And so, no, we will actually appreciate and celebrate God's justice. And if you look in the Apocalypse, the saints under the altar pray for and celebrate God's justice. I'm not trying to be morbid here, but we have to orient our views according to divine standards. And if that's what God deems just, then it would be a selfish attitude for me to be like, well, I don't like it. It's not fair. That's not fair. Right. I mean,
also, if God's the standard and he knows that people are suffering, does he not experience, that same kind of like suffering? Like, is he
right? I mean,
in God?
Well, and also in terms of, this view of justice is directly connected to free will as well, which, it's not like people are there. It's not my fault, right? They're there because they didn't want to love God. They chose not to love God. So the saints in the Apocalypse in chapters 5 and 6, right? They're extolling the justice of God. So, no, I might not like that they chose that, but at the same time, we have to love God above. That's why Jesus says that you have to love him above relatives even, right? Mark Mikesel, $50. Thanks, man. That's a big super chat. I was blessed to be introduced and get into your work back in the days of blood sports. That's funny. You eliminated a lot of bad arguments from my worldview. Oh, that's awesome. Good to hear that. I have since gotten an Orthodox study Bible for my friends and family, and I've shared that Russ Mannion paper to a lot of people. Hopefully, I'll join the Orthodox Church soon. Make sure to donate other Orthodox bros. Well, hey, thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. Father Deacon, thank you for, it's actually Father Deacon and Space Jockey that alerted me to the Russ Mannion works and papers. So I appreciate, because I know both of y'all have long time known Mannion, and now I didn't know about that paper when I was doing the blood sports stuff, but I'm glad that that's helpful to you. Stefano777, Pay Piggy, what's the difference between, I'll let Father Deacon have this. What is the difference between a coherentist and a person who's using coherentism as a tool within their argument or their worldview? Can you give examples of the difference between a straight up coherentist and somebody using an argument?
Is that what the question was? Whether one could want to be coherent, but not be a coherentist?
Yeah, basically.
Or using a coherentist argument, but not being a coherentist.
What is the difference between coherentism as a tool and coherentism as a epistemology or worldview?
I mean, I'm just going to assume, take a gander what the person means by tool.
I think they just mean using a coherentist argument like we do, right? Or an insight.
Yeah.
Without
for
adopting
example,
a secular epistemology of coherentism.
there are, just like we've been talking about all night, there's things that within the epistemological view of coherentism that are true. And for example, the way that meaning works is there's kind of verificationalism.
Epistemic holism. How's that?
Yeah, epistemic holism. So the way that our statements and propositions work is not in kind of isolation, but in a kind of whole. And the same with the meaning of our words. That's true. So you could use what the coherentist epistemologist says about that, that's true, to then critique somebody that has some kind of verificationalist principle, or kind of like meaning and truth, or like a one-to-one course, like a correspondence theorist, like a strict view or something like that, without actually saying adopting coherentism. Just like we might use arguments that David Hume brings up, skeptical arguments, to challenge other positions. It doesn't mean we're Humeans, unapologetic Humeans or something like that. Because in the end, coherentism has the same problem, not the, how should I put this? Not the same. It doesn't get out of the problem just as foundationalism doesn't get out of the problem. So just because you may use coherentist things that the coherentists say that are true to critique foundationalism, it doesn't mean, oh, well, that must mean that coherentism actually gets out of the whole epistemic quandary. No, they're in the same epistemic quandary for different reasons, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I could be a coherentist and think that every belief is foundational, and it would just be another version of foundationalism, and so it wouldn't ever escape the challenges of the problems of foundationalism. If you read the Mannion paper, there's a section where he talks about this, about coherentism. Palantir, $3. Guys, just a question to clarify. If evil is a privation, then are there degrees of closeness and privation on a scale? So to be clear, there's two different senses of the word evil. There's evil as privation, and there's evil as a moral act. And there are two different senses of the way the word is used, even in Scripture. So, for example, I might lack 2 eyes. I get a pirate patch because my eye get gouged out, right? So I'm deprived of 2 eyes, and that's an evil. But there's no necessarily any moral violation involved in me lacking 2 eyes. But if I commit a sin, that's a moral evil, and that's a different sense of what we mean by.
Now, if you jab your eyes and make yourself blind, then.
What about he says, what about a lesser good, in some sense, a privation from a greater good? Is that a relative evil? No, I don't think there's evils involved in that at all. So if you read City of God, for example, Augustine uses analogies for evil, like darkness and light. But again, it's two different senses, right? So, for example, when the fathers talk about the moral sense of evil, that's a movement of the will away from or against the good. That doesn't make the will evil. It doesn't make the movement of your will inherently evil. But in the action, when you act against the good, that's what moral evil is. But even privations themselves are not necessarily evil. For example, non-being is a privation. That doesn't make non-being inherently evil. And Staniloy covers this in his book when he talks about the fact that we don't think that God is in a dialectical opposition to non-being. That's where a lot of philosophers came up with this idea that from all eternity there was this dialectical opposition between non-being and being. If being is good, then non-being itself is what evil is. And that lends to the notion of evil being a metaphysical thing primarily, when it's not. Evil is used in different senses in different contexts. And for the Christian, primarily speaking, evil is referring to moral actions. It's an ethical problem. It's not a metaphysical problem. It might have metaphysical implications. If I sin, for example, let's say I'm addicted to heroin, okay? The more that, or fentanyl, right? If I'm a fentanyl addict, my vice eventually will kill me, right? But opioids in themselves are not inherently evil. Cocaine is not inherently evil, right? Alcohol is not inherently evil. It's the misuse of the things that becomes, right, sin. The wages of sin is death, Paul says, right? Father Deacon, would you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, you said it well. What can I say?
Well, I know you have a lot of experience with no, I'm just joking. With fentanyl and heroin. I'm joking.
Well, yeah. I mean, so, again, I always like to use the word use. That, and again, like some people in the chat, did you not listen to the stream? Are you not? Hello. Everything that exists is good. The use of it, how is it supposed to exist? Okay. Morphine has a purpose, right? Those opiates you can misuse them, and everything's like that. Now, it doesn't mean the hippie, like, oh man, God made shrooms, so they must be good to eat. Where it's like, well, God made hemlock too, right?
Yeah, right.
I'm not saying like,
yeah, okay, Socrates. Yeah, enjoy your drink.
Look, that doesn't mean that like you can eat everything. That's not its proper use, perhaps. So again, everything that exists is good, insofar as it's bad, and if it's misused.
Frankie D, $3. Jay, I watch your videos on the essence synergy distinction. Thank you for helping clear things up. I appreciate both of you. Shout out to the guys in the Discord for all the extra resources. God bless. Thank you, Frankie D. Glad we can help out. Palantir, $3. Question about, this might sound ridiculous, but honestly, I'm asking this in good faith. If someone is an addict and very far gone with certain problems or passions or addictions, let's say lust, could the drastic approach of Origen be a last-ditch way? No. So again, the problem with lust is not your bodily organs. And that was the thing that Origen learned, was that lust is a problem of the passions, not the body. So mutilating yourself, which is condemned and forbidden, you can't self-mutilate. You're not supposed to do that. No. I mean, typically I don't give moral advice, but I think that's an open and shut case. No, you can't castrate yourself, because that's the point, is that the problem isn't your testicles. And Origen discovered when he castrated himself that he still had disordered desires. It didn't solve the problem. So no, there is not a last ditch effort in terms of that. There might be certain, I don't know what you think, but this is, again, I can't give anybody advice on this, but I had a friend who was a severe alcoholic, and it was evident that he was eventually going to die, and he did. He died, I think, about 6-8 months ago. And there was a point where it came up in passing discussion, like, well, supposedly there was this treatment about shrooms or something, I don't know, but some doctor had some treatment for severe addicts to do shrooms as like a last resort for people that were so severely alcoholic that it was going to kill them. Maybe in a case like that, there could be a justification for extenuating treatment circumstances. I don't know, Father Deacon, what you think about that.
Yeah, Kotel and I had talked about this too, and that in that case, it's used as medicine. That's something, again, you would talk to a doctor that you trust and your spiritual father about. But in principle, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, I mean, I wouldn't see a problem with that. I do know that they use shrooms for cluster headaches. So what clearly is forbidden is using substances to reach some type of spiritual heightened spiritual state.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's not using for the purpose of that, right? It's a different use. And Dr. Bradshaw was recently on that video with Ubi, which everybody should go watch the interview that they did, Lewis and Ubi, with Dr. Bradshaw, and then Ubi's video on contraceptive, because it all gets into the topic of tonight, what we've been talking about, because Bradshaw gives a couple examples of how, for example, in Roman Catholic theology specifically, there's never a case when there can be the existence of semen that isn't for the express purpose of childbearing. But Dr. Bradshaw gave some examples where, well, what about the case of an individual who has problems with that area, blockages, and so there has to be an extraction? And in Roman Catholic theology, it's never allowed, ever. Like, it's not possible. So that, in other words, that person would be in a situation where they would have to commit a mortal sin to preserve their health, where in Roman Catholic theology, you also have the duty to preserve your health too. So that it would be impossible. Anyway, it's a dilemma that, right, that's a problem for Roman Catholicism, as well as the medieval problems of ensoulment, where the Roman Catholic Church in many cases did affirm, I'm trying to avoid the algorithm terms, abortion, right? And Father Deacon, you've made this point a lot, and it's something that has come up a lot, that Roman Catholics just to ignore, or they talk around, and even the papal affirmations of this, which Ubi brings up. So in other words, all that's just to say that there's not one universal all the time Catholic position. It's actually evolved. That's the whole point. The whole video is just trying to show that Roman Catholics are always calling out Orthodox that you don't have a clear position on contraceptives, we got you, as if it's a gotcha. And the whole video is just showing that you don't actually have this. Your position has evolved. So you're all the more without basis in making the argument against us. So it's a great video, and they pulled it off excellently. And they interviewed Dr. Bradshaw on the paper that he presented that will be published soon about this problem in Aquinas. What does it mean to be contrary to nature, right? And the unnatural vice. So when Aquinas deals with this, he actually makes the argument that following Aristotle, solo actions, I think you know what I mean, are worse than incest in his and that's because of the natural law argumentation there, in viewing the body parts having, the organs have only one purpose, right? That's determined supposedly by
you want to hear my argument,
natural
my
law.
critique?
Yeah, if you just talk around the algorithm.
Papism has no clear universal agreement on integral calculus. Huh? It has to be wrong.
You lost me. What do you mean?
Derivatives. What's that?
You lost me. I don't get it.
Well, I'm just making it like, let's just pick some topic, right? And say, well, wait a minute. I don't see any clear consensus.
Oh, okay.
On integral calculus. So then he comes back and says, well, that's not on faith and morals. So then you switch the conversation. Well, there's no clear consensus, universal consensus on the trolley problem, huh? So Roman Catholicism must be false.
Oh, I see. In other words, the premise is wrong from the outset, that if your position doesn't have a clear universal consensus on XYZ moral issue, then de facto it's false. So is that what makes positions true or false, by picking anything that doesn't have a universal?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a fallacious line of argument. That's great. But of course, they always appeal to this, right? Oh, you don't have a clear, and then that's why the divorce video that Ubi made was really good, and then this one kind of goes along with that. But they relied on the arguments from Bradshaw's paper. And as a side note, by the way, are Roman Catholics, are you guys not aware that both Augustine and Aquinas argued for the ends justify the means for cities to have houses of ill repute? A lot of Roman Catholics don't know that, and they're surprised when they find that out. But yes, Augustine thought
which I always argue is equivalent to the people that say we should have baccalia brosh.
Yes, exactly. Because the argument is that, well, if we don't allow it, people are just going to do it in their own ways, and it's even worse, right? And so both Augustine and Aquinas posed the argument that, well, cities should have houses of ill repute, because if you don't have that, more people will be sleeping with each other's spouses, and it'll be even worse than if there is a known public house of ill repute.
It's the Biden pipe special.
Let's see. Well, Emmanuel, $5 contribution for the tamales. Okay, much appreciated. Because you were doing the essay, Father Deacon. So now you got some tamales.
Get out on me.
Letter A, $5. This is great. Thank you, Father Deacon. I've never heard of you, but I'm excited to check out your channel. Yeah, his channel is linked in the description. Daniel 221. What is the view of Macedonian Orthodox baptism since they are in schism? Yeah, I don't think schism affects the Orthodox form of baptism, right? I mean, a Macedonian Orthodox that's in schism, or like a Ukrainian Orthodox that's in schism, I don't think that we would grant that they have the sacramental grace if they're in schism. But the baptism itself is not the problem. It's the same way that if a Coptic person became Orthodox, their baptism could be accepted by economia, but that doesn't mean that the Coptics have the grace of baptism necessarily. Valentine, $5. Thank you, Jay, Father Deacon. Another informative view. Here's some pay piggies. Pay piggies unite and pay up. Thank you very much. Anything you want to leave us with, Father Deacon?
Let's all pray for each other. Let's again, we're last stretch to Holy Pascha and the resurrection. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about are spiritual issues. We all can fall into them. And let's just try to acquire more a humble spirit, a spirit of chastity. Let's say this St. Ephraim prayer. Let's all try to acquire that. Because really about everything we were talking about really kind of boils down to that let's not do it on our own. Let's let the those with the authority and training to do those jobs as far as making these things, and point people. And what do we always say, Jay? Go talk to your spiritual father. Go point people in the right direction. We do our best online to provide good Orthodox content and directions, but it's no surrogate for face-to-face